Section 1. The show that was never supposed to offend anyone. There is a version of The Simpsons that never existed outside of network meetings and nervous memos. It was a polished, agreeable version, a show that was edgy in the way that network executives in 1989 understood edgy to mean slightly rude, occasionally irreverent, but ultimately harmless. A show that would ruffle a few feathers and then apologize for it. A show that, when complaints came in, would straighten itself out and fall back into line like a dog that had briefly considered running but remembered where its food bowl was. That version never made it to air. What made it to air instead was something far stranger and far more interesting. A show that, in the span of a single decade, would be pulled off the air in multiple countries, edited under pressure from governments and religious groups, banned outright by broadcasters who thought they knew exactly what kind of thing they were dealing with, and then watched by those same countries anyway through bootleg tapes and pirated recordings that spread across the world before the internet existed to help them along. What we are going to do tonight slowly, in as much detail as each story deserves, is go through every episode of The Simpsons that was banned, pulled, edited, or suppressed somewhere in the world. We are going to look at why it happened, who made the decision, what the episode actually contained that caused the panic, and what the reaction looked like on the other side of the broadcast signal. Some of these stories are funny, some are strange. Some reveal something uncomfortable about the country or network that decided a cartoon was too dangerous to be seen. And some of them, when you sit with them long enough, tell you something about The Simpsons itself that the show has never quite acknowledged directly. The pattern behind every ban. The reason why this particular show, out of all the shows that have ever existed on television, kept finding itself at the center of exactly this kind of conflict. But we are going to take our time with all of it. So get comfortable. Find a position that works for you. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow. The night is quiet, and we are going to spend it in Springfield. The first thing you need to understand about The Simpsons and censorship is that the show was considered dangerous before a single episode had aired. Not controversial, not potentially offensive, dangerous. There were people inside the Fox Broadcasting Company, inside the standards and practices departments that every American network maintained in that era, who looked at the early animatics and rough cuts of what Matt Groening and James L. Brooks and Sam Simon were building and felt a specific, identifiable fear. The fear was not about any individual scene or joke. The fear was about the show's fundamental premise. The Simpsons was built on the idea that the American family, the nuclear family that had been the bedrock subject of American television since Leave It to Beaver and The Donna Reed Show, was not a collection of cheerful people who had minor misunderstandings and learned lessons. It was a collection of specific, recognizable, deeply imperfect human beings who were held together by something real but not always visible, and who spent most of their time being wrong about things in ways that were funny rather than instructive. Homer was not a gently bumbling father who occasionally needed to be taught a lesson by his patient wife. Homer was a man with a genuine intellectual limitation, a dangerous job he could not perform, an eating habit that bordered on compulsion, a drinking habit that was treated as background noise rather than a character flaw, and a capacity for selfishness that he never fully overcame and was never fully punished for. And he was the hero. The audience was supposed to love him. Bart was not a little rascal who got into mischief and came around by the third act. Bart was a child who failed academically, defied authority as a reflex rather than a strategy, and viewed the adults around him with an undisguised contempt that the show treated as reasonable rather than as a character flaw to be corrected by the end of the episode. Lisa was a child so alienated from the world she lived in that she had essentially constructed a private interior life that bore almost no relationship to the external circumstances of her family. She was brilliant, isolated, morally serious in a world that found moral seriousness annoying, and the show never suggested she was wrong to be any of these things. Marge held all of it together through a combination of patience and will that the show sometimes presented as admirable and sometimes presented as something closer to resignation. She was the center that held. She was also, in ways the show occasionally acknowledged and then moved away from, a person whose own needs had been quietly set aside in service of everyone else's needs for so long that she had stopped expecting anything different. And the show never apologized for any of this. That was what made standards and practices nervous. Not that Homer drank beer, not that Bart said words that were slightly rude for primetime television, but that the show presented all of it without the correction. Without the little moral pivot in the third act where the character realizes what they have done wrong and becomes slightly better, without the reassuring narrative signal that told the audience, we know this behavior is not ideal, and we want you to know that we know that. The Simpsons did not do that. When Homer drank too much beer and fell asleep on the couch, the show did not cut to a scene where Homer reflected on his alcohol consumption and decided to make a change. When Bart talked back to a teacher, the show did not construct a moment where Bart understood the error of his ways. The behavior was simply part of who these people were, and the show expected the audience to understand the difference between depicting something and endorsing it. That distinction, which seems obvious when you state it plainly, was not obvious to everyone in 1989. And the places where that distinction was most contested are the places where The Simpsons ran into trouble. The first episode that generated genuine, organized protest rather than scattered individual complaints was from Season 2. The episode is called Itchy and Scratchy and Marge, and it aired on the 20th of December 1990. If you know the show at all, you know Itchy and Scratchy. They are the cartoon within the cartoon, the ultra-violent cat and mouse show that Bart and Lisa watch on television inside the world of Springfield. The joke was always pointed. Itchy and Scratchy are a direct parody of Tom and Jerry and the broader tradition of animated violence that American children had been consuming for decades, while adults argued about whether it was harming them. The Simpsons had been using Itchy and Scratchy as a background element since the first season, a quick gag that acknowledged and mocked the absurdity of cartoon violence without making too much of it. But Itchy and Scratchy and Marge decided to make everything of it. The episode begins when Maggie, still a baby, watches an Itchy and Scratchy cartoon in which Itchy beats Scratchy over the head with a mallet. Shortly afterward, Maggie picks up a mallet of her own and hits Homer over the head with it while he is bent down looking for something under the sink. Homer ends up in the hospital. Marge concludes that Maggie has been directly influenced by the cartoon, and she decides to do something about it. What Marge does is launch a campaign against the Itchy and Scratchy show. She writes letters, she organizes mothers, she appears on local television to make her case. And her campaign works. The producers of Itchy and Scratchy, caving to public pressure, clean up their show and transform it into something gentle and bloodless and entirely boring. The children of Springfield, deprived of the cartoon violence they loved, actually go outside and play. Springfield briefly becomes idyllic. Then comes the pivot. Michelangelo's David is coming to the Springfield Museum. A group of censorious citizens, energized by their success against Itchy and Scratchy, decide to protest the statue because it is nude. They want it covered. They want the David, one of the most celebrated works of art in human history, dressed in shorts and a modest top before the children of Springfield are exposed to it. Marge refuses to join this campaign. She tells the protesters that there is a difference between gratuitous violence in entertainment and classical art. The protesters do not accept this distinction. As far as they are concerned, they are applying the same logic Marge applied to Itchy and Scratchy, just to a different subject. If media depictions of violence harm children, why wouldn't media depictions of nudity harm them too? Marge is stuck. She spent the first half of the episode arguing that media depictions of violence could influence children's behavior, and now she is arguing that depictions of the human body cannot. The protesters are simply using her own argument against her. And the episode does not rescue her with a clever counter-argument that makes everything tidy. It sits with the discomfort. It lets Marge be inconsistent, and it lets the audience see the inconsistency without resolving it neatly. This structural choice to depict a character caught in a genuine logical contradiction and not provide an easy exit was unusual for primetime American television in 1990. Most shows that engaged with social debates structured the debate so that the show's correct position would be clear by the end. The audience was meant to know who won the argument and why. Itchy and Scratchy and Marge did not do this. It trusted the audience to hold two uncomfortable ideas at once, and the audience for the most part managed it. But the people most invested in the media violence debate did not feel the episode was being fair to their position. Complaints came from two directions. Some came from conservative family groups who felt the episode was mocking people who objected to media violence. The episode showed the anti-cartoon campaign working children went outside. Springfield became pleasant, which felt like validation. But it also showed Marge becoming uncomfortable when the logic of censorship was applied to art, which felt like the episode was then undermining that validation. The episode refused to take a clean side, and for people accustomed to television taking clean sides, that refusal felt like mockery. Other complaints came from the opposite direction, from people who felt the episode was using Marge's inconsistency to argue that concerns about media violence were hypocritical, that the show was sneaking in a pro-cartoon violence position while appearing to examine the question fairly. These two sets of complaints are contradictory. One group thought the episode was mocking censorship, the other thought it was endorsing it. The same episode generated both responses simultaneously. The episode was genuinely doing both things at once, holding two ideas in the air and declining to resolve the tension between them. The episode was not banned anywhere in the world, but it was cited in a congressional hearing on television violence in 1990, making it the first Simpsons episode to become part of a real political conversation rather than simply an entertainment controversy. Senator Paul Simon, leading a push for television industry self-regulation, referenced The Simpsons specifically in discussions about the effects of animated violence on children. He was not calling for a ban. He was using it as an example of the kind of content he believed the industry should take more responsibility for. What that hearing produced, eventually, was the television rating system that still exists in modified form today. The V-chip legislation, the content ratings labels at the beginning of programs, the whole infrastructure of television content warnings that became standard practice in the 1990s, all of that has a partial origin in the debate that Itchy and Scratchy and Marge helped to accelerate. A cartoon about violence contributed to the creation of the content warning system now attached to every television program in America. There is something appropriately Simpsons-shaped about that. The same general period produced something quieter but in some ways more telling. A situation that was less about organized protest and more about the kind of institutional discomfort that settles over a single broadcaster and causes them to make a decision without fully explaining it to anyone. Homer's Triple Bypass aired in the United States on the 17th of December 1992. Homer, after experiencing increasingly alarming chest pains while watching television and eating, is told by his doctor that he needs triple bypass heart surgery. The episode deals with Homer's fear of dying, the family's fear of losing him, and the economic reality that Homer cannot afford the surgery through normal channels. The UK's BBC received this episode for review as part of their process of evaluating content before broadcast. The review returned with a flag. The flag was not about the surgery being depicted graphically. The concern was more subtle. The BBC's medical advisors expressed worry that the episode might discourage people who genuinely needed heart surgery from seeking it. The concern was that the comedic framing the incompetent doctor, Nick Riviera, the chaotic hospital, the suggestion that medical care was administered by fools might cause someone with real cardiac symptoms to delay treatment. This is a specific kind of objection, not moral, not political, a public health concern calibrated to a specific and vulnerable population. People experiencing chest pain and already afraid of surgery were, in the BBC's analysis, a population that might be adversely affected by watching an episode that treated cardiac surgery as a comedy of errors. The episode did eventually air in the UK without edits, but with deliberation about scheduling. The delay and the nature of the concern represent something unusual in Simpsons censorship history. An objection not to the content being offensive, but to the content potentially having measurable effects on people's health-related behavior. It is notably the same basic logic that Marge used in Itchy and Scratchy and Marge, that media depictions of something influence how people engage with that thing in real life. The show kept running into this argument from every direction. Whatever the episode was about, someone somewhere was making the case that the way the episode depicted that thing would change how people thought about it and behaved toward it. There is also something worth noting about the very first Simpsons episode produced, before we move further into the censorship history. Some Enchanted Evening was the first episode produced for Season 1, even though it aired last. When the production team saw the finished animation, they were deeply alarmed. The quality was far below what they had been expecting. There were conversations about whether to scrap the episode entirely, and beyond that, whether to abandon the series altogether before it had properly begun. The crisis was resolved by deadline pressure, budget reality, and the fact that a different animation studio had produced better work for other episodes. The show went forward, but the near abandonment is a piece of censorship history of a specific kind. The show almost self-censored before it began, not by cutting a scene or toning down a joke, but by nearly deciding the whole enterprise was not good enough to put on television. It went to air. The series found its footing. And the show that nearly didn't happen went on to be the most discussed, most analyzed, and most censored animated series in television history. Before we move into the stranger stories, drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is there. We love knowing where in the world this is reaching tonight. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good moment. We have a long way still to go, and there is a lot more Springfield to explore. Section 2. The Ghost in the Machine. The Michael Jackson episode. There are episodes of The Simpsons that were banned for political reasons, episodes banned for religious reasons, episodes banned because a country found specific cultural content offensive to their national identity. There are episodes pulled because of how the world changed around them after they were made. Stark Raving Dad is all of these things at once, and none of them adequately describes what it is. Stark Raving Dad is Season 3, Episode 1. It aired on the 19th of September, 1991. It opened the third season of the show at a moment when The Simpsons had already become something more than a popular television program. It had become a shared cultural reference point, the kind of thing that a specific generation would carry with them, and, quote, to each other, for the rest of their lives. The episode centers on Homer being committed to a mental health facility after wearing a pink shirt to work. Mr. Burns notices the shirt. He interprets it as a sign of nonconformity and potential instability. He has Homer committed. While Homer is in the institution, he meets a large white man who claims to be Michael Jackson. The man, whose name is Leon Kompowski, has the speaking voice and mannerisms of Michael Jackson, the soft, slightly breathy cadence, the gentle and warm phrasing, the specific quality of attention that the public version of Michael Jackson always projected. He and Homer become friends. When Homer is released, Leon follows him home. He tries to help Bart write a birthday song for Lisa, whose birthday Bart has forgotten. The credited voice for this character in the original broadcast is John J. Smith, a pseudonym. John J. Smith was Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson watched The Simpsons. He loved The Simpsons. He called the show's producers personally and asked if he could be on it. He wanted to voice a character. The character he was given a large white man claiming to be Michael Jackson, which the episode presents as clearly absurd, given that the character looks nothing like Michael Jackson was a premise he reportedly found genuinely funny in a self-aware way. He understood the joke being told at his expense and chose to be part of it anyway. Jackson wanted to be credited under a pseudonym. He had appeared on television in so many ways and contexts that doing this one quietly, as a kind of inside joke that people might eventually figure out, appealed to him. The mystery of who was voicing Leon Kompowski circulated as entertainment gossip for years before being confirmed. Jackson wrote the birthday song at the end of the episode Happy Birthday Lisa, and was credited for the song under his own name in the closing titles. He was paid nothing for his performance. He did it because he wanted to be on the show. The episode won a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program. It is genuinely excellent. The relationship between Homer and Leon is warm and funny and oddly touching, and Homer's uncomplicated delight at having befriended someone who claims to be Michael Jackson without worrying too much about whether the claim is true is one of the purest expressions of Homer's character that the early seasons produced. The episode ended with Leon revealing that he was not actually Michael Jackson. He was a bricklayer from New Jersey named Leon Kompowski who spent years claiming to be Michael Jackson because it made people treat him kindly. The voice was a performance. The persona was borrowed. He checks himself out of the mental facility, speaking in his own ordinary voice, and disappears. It is a melancholy ending dressed up as a comic one. The kindest, most generous person in the episode turned out to be living inside a borrowed identity. His goodness was real. The self he performed in order to access that goodness was a fiction. The song he wrote for Lisa is real. The friendship he offered Homer was real. The generosity was real. The identity was not. You could write considerably about what that means in light of everything that followed. But let's stay with the episode itself for a moment, because it deserves to be appreciated on its own terms before the world outside it became what it became. In February 2019, the documentary Leaving Neverland aired. The documentary made detailed allegations of child sexual abuse against Michael Jackson, presented through the accounts of two men, Wade Robson and James Safechuck, who said they had been abused by Jackson when they were children. The allegations were not entirely new in the sense that Jackson had faced accusations before, including a criminal trial in 2005, from which he was acquitted. But Leaving Neverland presented those allegations in a form that had not previously been available. 2 hours of specific, detailed, Personal testimony from two men speaking directly to camera about what they said had happened across specific years. The reaction was immediate and wide. Radio stations pulled Michael Jackson's music from playlists. Streaming services fielded questions about his catalog. Museums reconsidered exhibits. The question of how to engage with work by someone accused of serious harm, a person who was no longer alive to respond, having died in 2009, became a live cultural debate with no obvious resolution. The Simpsons faced this question directly. In March 2019, James L. Brooks and Matt Groening and Al Jean made a decision. They removed Stark Raving Dad from circulation. The episode was pulled from Disney+, which had recently acquired rights to the show's back catalog. It was pulled from syndication packages. It disappeared from the streaming rotation. Physical media containing the episode was not recalled, but through any official channel the show's creators and distributors controlled, the episode was made unavailable. Their statement was careful. They did not say Jackson was guilty. They did not say the documentary proved anything. What they said was that the episode felt particularly uncomfortable to them in light of the allegations, and that they did not feel appropriate continuing to distribute it. The argument for removing the episode is coherent on its own terms. The episode celebrates Michael Jackson. It is warm toward him. It depicts him through Leon Kompowski, who shares his voice and warmth as a kind, creative person who befriends a lonely and baffled man and helps a child do something good for his sister. The episode does not reference any of the accusations that had circulated during Jackson's lifetime. It treats him as a beloved figure worthy of a loving portrait. Continuing to air that portrait in the view of the people who removed it felt tone-deaf given what the documentary alleged. The episode was, in a real sense, a piece of affectionate tribute to a man being accused of horrific things. Keeping it in circulation felt like an implicit endorsement. The argument against removing it is also coherent, and it comes from a different direction. The episode is a piece of cultural work that exists independently of what Michael Jackson may or may not have done. Removing it does not undo anything. It does not help the men who made allegations in the documentary. What it does is erase a piece of television history based on accusations that were never tested in court, in a case where the accused person died before the documentary was made and could not respond to these specific allegations. The episode was made in good faith by people who had no knowledge of any of this. The episode won an Emmy. The decision to remove it because of its guest star's later conduct punishes the episode for something the episode did not do and something the people who made it could not have known. The creative team's position was not about guilt. Their position was about their own comfort with distributing the episode. They were not comfortable. They removed it. They have not reversed that decision. What makes Stark Raving Dad unusual in the history of Simpsons censorship is the nature of the decision. Most episodes we will discuss tonight were banned or restricted by external parties: a government, a broadcaster, a religious organization. Someone outside the creative process looked at what had been made and decided it could not be seen. Stark Raving Dad was pulled by the people who made it. This is a fundamentally different kind of decision. It is self-censorship, but not the kind driven by institutional pressure from above. It was driven by the creative team's own discomfort, their own relationship to what they had made and what the context around it had become. There is no external force requiring the decision. Fox did not mandate it. No government demanded it. No advertiser withdrew. The decision came from inside the room where the show was made. Whether it was right is a question that serious people continue to disagree about. It involves ideas about what art owes to its audience, whether a piece of work can be separated from the conduct of those who participated in making it, whether removing something from circulation is a form of accountability or erasure. These are genuinely hard questions. What is clear is that the decision was sincere. The people who pulled it did it because they felt they should, because the episode meant something different to them after February 2019 than it had meant before. That change in meaning was not in the episode. It was in them, and they decided that what was now in them made it impossible to keep distributing what was in the episode. The other story Stark Raving Dad is telling, the one that got lost, involves Homer being institutionalized for wearing the wrong color shirt. Mr. Burns sees the pink shirt. He decides it indicates instability. He has Homer committed. The mental health facility where Homer ends up is drawn with the casual cruelty. The Simpsons often applies to institutions: orderlies who are disinterested, doctors who are overwhelmed, a physical environment that looks less like a place of healing than a place of containment. a warehouse for people who have been defined as problems rather than as patients. This part of the episode generated almost no controversy, which is interesting because it contains the episode's sharpest social commentary. The idea that a man could be committed to a psychiatric facility for wearing the wrong color shirt, that the institutional apparatus of mental health care could be weaponized by a wealthy employer to remove an inconvenient employee, is not a comedy premise in the same way the Michael Jackson plot is. It is a serious observation about how power works, dressed in the visual language of cartoon comedy. Homer does nothing wrong. He wears a shirt. His employer decides the shirt makes him a liability. The result is that Homer is removed from society until he can be made to conform. The show made this kind of observation constantly in its early seasons, and the comedy worked well enough that the serious observation often went unnoticed by everyone except those already inclined to notice it. Stark Raving Dad became remembered as the Michael Jackson episode and was eventually pulled because of Michael Jackson. The other thing it was saying has been largely lost in the process, which may be appropriate for a show that keeps saying things nobody is quite ready to hear. Section 3. The Towers, the Television, and the Episodes That Vanished. The story of the city of New York versus Homer Simpson begins in 1997 and takes a turn in 2001 that nobody who made the episode could have anticipated. The episode aired on the 21st of September 1997 as the first episode of Season 9. The premise is simple. Homer's car has been impounded in New York City after Barney borrowed it, got drunk, and left it illegally parked between the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. Homer, who has not visited New York since a bad experience in 1976, depicted through flashback as a comedy of sustained menace, is forced to go and retrieve the car himself. Homer hates New York. He has always hated it, with the specific hatred that comes from having had a bad experience in a place and allowing that experience to calcify into permanent judgment. The city is noise, density, people who move too fast and do not apologize when they bump into you. It is the opposite of Springfield in almost every way, and Homer experiences that opposition as a form of personal assault. The episode is a love letter to New York disguised as a complaint about it. Homer's revulsion becomes, over the course of the episode, a kind of bewildered appreciation. New York is overwhelming. It is also undeniably alive, too large and too full to be contained. The World Trade Center appears prominently throughout. Homer's car is parked between the two towers. Much of the episode's second and third act involves Homer trying to navigate the area around the towers, being unable to get his car moved, running between the two buildings in increasing frustration while the wheel clamp prevents him from simply driving away. The camera depicts the towers as they always appeared in establishing shots of New York, enormous and silver, and absolutely, inarguably there. After the 11th of September 2001, Fox pulled the episode from syndication. The decision was made quickly and without much public deliberation. The episode contained extensive footage of the World Trade Center used as a central plot location. Watching it after the attacks felt genuinely strange, not offensive, not disrespectful, but displaced, as if the images had become something different than what they were when they were shot. The towers were not background detail. They were the story's focal point. Watching Homer complain about them and run between them carried a weight that nothing in the episode had put there. Fox pulled the episode. It disappeared from the syndication rotation that had been sending The Simpsons into American homes every day for nearly a decade. The episode was not the only thing to disappear from American media in that period. The weeks following September 11th produced a remarkable moment of collective media caution. Content depicting skyscrapers in distress, planes crashing, or Manhattan under threat of any kind was quietly removed from rotation across multiple platforms. Films were re-edited to remove shots of the towers from skyline footage. Songs were pulled from radio playlists based on lyrical content that now felt differently charged. Television shows were reviewed for content that might feel jarring to an audience processing collective trauma. The cultural logic was understandable in the immediate aftermath. People were grieving. Images of threatened or destroyed buildings might trigger real pain. There was no good reason to broadcast entertainment that might compound that pain. The cultural logic became more complicated as months passed, and some decisions did not reverse. Content pulled in September 2001 stayed away. Some of it remained in limbo, not officially banned, not officially available through regular means, existing in the version of the show stored in your memory or on VHS tape but absent from the version the network was willing to show. The City of New York versus Homer Simpson, stayed in limbo for approximately 5 years. It returned to syndication rotation around 2006. By then, the cultural conversation around the towers had shifted enough that the episode could be broadcast again without the same feeling of displacement. But the 5 years of absence had changed something about the experience of watching it, not in the episode itself, which was not altered, but in what the audience brought to it. When the episode returned, the towers in it were different. Not because anything in the footage had changed, because the audience had changed. You bring something to those images now that the people who shot them in 1996 could not have placed there. A knowledge of a specific morning, a memory of how the skyline looked and then how it stopped looking that way. The show did not put that there. History put it there. A second episode was also pulled in that period, less famous but worth noting. New Kids on the Block aired on the 25th of February 2001, 6 months before the attacks. The plot involves Bart joining a boy band that turns out to be a front for a United States Navy recruitment drive. The episode parodies late 1990s pop music aesthetics with considerable precision and genuine affection. The satire of military recruitment dressed as entertainment is pointed and real. The episode's ending involves a music video in which warships fire missiles at an unnamed foreign city. The sequence is played for comedy part of an over-the-top video framing the show within the show premise. After September 11th, this episode was pulled. The footage of military strikes felt different in October 2001 than it had in February. Not because the episode had done anything wrong, because the audience's emotional relationship to images of military action had been fundamentally altered. The pull was shorter than the New York episodes. The episode returned to rotation faster. The military imagery, while jarring, did not carry the same specific and personal weight as images of the World Trade Center. But it was pulled, and the fact that it was says something about how broadly Fox was sweeping in that period. The net was large. It caught things that were not really related to September 11th at all, and it kept them away from viewers for months. The City of New York versus Homer Simpson became, in the years after its return, an unusual object. It is simultaneously a very funny episode and a document of a before that no longer exists. Both things are true at the same time, and neither cancels the other. This is one of the genuinely strange properties of long-running television. When a show runs for 36 years, the world changes around episodes without the episodes knowing it. Footage that was innocent becomes charged. Images that meant one thing come to mean another. The episode stays fixed. The world shifts around it. And the viewer who watches it today carries the shift with them into the experience, whether they want to or not. Expansion A. Before the Bands. The fight to get the show made. There is a version of this story that starts with the first official controversy, the first letter from a pressure group, the first congressional mention of The Simpsons by name. That version misses something important. The real beginning of the story of The Simpsons and censorship is not the first public objection to the show. It is the first internal objection to the show, the resistance that had to be overcome before a single episode ever reached the air. Because the most significant battles were not fought in public. They were fought in conference rooms at Fox, between a creative team that knew what they wanted to make and a network that was not entirely sure it wanted to let them make it. Understanding those early internal battles makes everything that happened later more legible. The show's entire career in relation to institutional authority, the bans, the complaints, the affiliate refusals, the congressional hearings was a continuation of a negotiation that began before the show's first episode aired. And in that negotiation, the show won. Not because it was right, not because it was better, but because it was too profitable to stop and too popular to control. Let's go back to 1987. Fox Broadcasting Company was 3 years old. It had launched in 1986 with the intention of becoming a fourth major American broadcast network, competing with NBC, ABC, and CBS. The ambition was enormous. The resources were real. Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation had the capital to sustain a loss-making period while the network built its audience. But in 1987, Fox was still a challenger, still trying to find the programming that would define it. Barry Diller, who ran Fox at the time, understood that challengers do not win by doing what the established players do. They win by doing what the established players cannot or will not do. Fox could not outspend NBC. It could not replicate the institutional authority of CBS. What it could do was take risks that the established networks with their massive investments in the existing order, could not afford. James L. Brooks, Matt Groening, and Sam Simon came to Fox with the outline of what would become The Simpsons. They had been making animated shorts for the Tracy Ullman Show 30-second bumpers featuring a dysfunctional family with yellow skin and overbites. The shorts were popular. The characters were distinctive. The question was whether there was enough there for a half-hour show. Diller and his team said yes. They commissioned The Simpsons for a first season. And the negotiation about what the show would be allowed to be began. The first significant internal battle was about Bart. The network's initial instinct was that Bart was too negative a role model for children. He was disobedient. He was casually disrespectful to authority. He did things that children should not be encouraged to do and seemed to face insufficient consequences for those things. This is not a surprising concern. American children's entertainment had been shaped for decades by principles that emphasized positive modeling characters who demonstrated pro-social behavior, faced consequences for antisocial behavior, and generally provided a template that parents could point to and say, "Be like this." Bart was not that. Bart was a character who did what he felt like doing, said what he felt like saying, and existed in a more complicated relationship to consequence than simple positive modeling called for. The consequences in the show were real, but not always redemptive. Bart did not usually learn the lesson. He experienced the consequence and then went on being Bart. The creative team's position was that this was precisely the point. The show was not trying to model good behavior for children. It was trying to tell true stories about family life, including the true story that children are not always models of pro-social behavior, that they do not always learn lessons, that the family unit absorbs and continues despite this. The Simpsons family was functional because it kept trying, not because it always succeeded. The network eventually accepted this argument, partly through persuasion and partly through the demonstration that audiences were responding. The Bart Simpson merchandising phenomenon of 1,990, the moment when Bart's face appeared on tens of millions of t-shirts and became a genuine cultural moment, settled the internal debate about whether Bart was an asset or a liability. He was obviously an asset. The network moved on. But the argument had to be made. The network's default instinct was toward safety. The creative team's instinct was toward honesty. The show that existed was the product of that negotiation. The second significant internal battle was about Homer. Homer Simpson is, by almost any objective standard, a terrible father. He is selfish, lazy, impulsive, frequently violent toward Bart in ways the show plays as comedic, and almost entirely incapable of the sustained thoughtfulness that careful parenting requires. He loves his family, genuinely and without qualification, but his love does not prevent him from being bad at expressing it in the ways that matter. The network's concern was that Homer was too negative a depiction of the American father. The early 1980s had seen a significant cultural moment around the concept of the involved, present, emotionally competent American father. The Cosby Show had been enormously successful, partly because it offered a depiction of fatherhood as something warm and competent and reliable. The network, seeing that success, was uncertain about a show offering a father who was none of those things. The creative team's position was again that this was the point. The vast majority of American fathers were not Cliff Huxtable. They were trying their best, frequently failing, loving their families imperfectly in the way that imperfect people love. Homer was not a model of bad fatherhood. He was a recognizable depiction of ordinary fatherhood, the kind that exists in the real world rather than the idealized version that television had largely been showing. This argument was also eventually accepted. But again, it had to be made. The default was toward the positive model. The show had to fight, internally, before it ever reached the public, to be allowed to depict reality as reality was, rather than as institutional preference would have it. The third internal battle was about the animation itself. The early episodes of The Simpsons were animated by Klasky Csupo, a company that delivered the rough, slightly off-model animation that characterized the first two seasons. The network had concerns about the animation quality, not aesthetic concerns, but concerns about whether the animation was polished enough for the kind of primetime audience Fox was hoping to build. The creative team wanted the roughness. The imperfection was part of the show's aesthetic DNA. It was not the sleek corporate animation of network Saturday morning cartoons. It was something stranger and more personal and less finished, more like what it might look like if a cartoonist's notebook came to life than like what a committee had designed to appeal to maximum demographic breadth. The compromise that emerged was that the animation became somewhat more polished over the early seasons without losing its essential character. The second and third seasons are more refined than the first. The fourth and fifth represent a kind of peak detailed enough to be impressive, strange enough to retain the show's distinctive visual personality. But the fight to preserve the strangeness of the show's look was real. The network's instinct was towards smooth and polished. The creative team's instinct was towards something that looked like it was made by people rather than by a production system. The show exists in the space between those instincts. The standards and practices process at Fox was, in the show's early years, less rigorous than it would become. Fox was a new network. Its standards and practices department was still developing its institutional culture. The people who reviewed Simpsons scripts before production were working out what the rules were at the same time as they were applying them. There was genuine ambiguity about what was and was not acceptable. The creative team used that ambiguity. Some Enchanted Evening is the final episode of Season 1 and was actually produced first. It was the first episode completed and the first episode to be reviewed by the network, and the network hated it. The animation was considered not up to standard. Several elements of the script were considered problematic. The episode that had been intended as the season premiere was pushed to the finale while the rest of the season was produced. The experience of that first review shaped the creative team's approach for the seasons that followed. They learned what the network's concerns were. They learned where the lines were and how close they could come to those lines. They learned which kinds of objections could be overcome through argument and which kinds could not. And they got better at threading the needle at making the show they wanted to make in ways that managed to pass through the review process. This is not cynical. The process was genuinely a negotiation. The network had legitimate concerns that the creative team had to engage with, rather than simply ignore. The creative team had a vision for what the show should be that the network had to engage with rather than simply override. The show that resulted was the product of that mutual engagement, and it was, by any measure, extraordinary. The congressional hearings that included The Simpsons were part of a longer story about American television's relationship with political regulation. American broadcast television operates under a federal licensing regime. The Federal Communications Commission licenses broadcast frequencies. Broadcasters must hold licenses from the FCC to operate, and licenses can be revoked. They rarely are, but the threat is real and the industry knows it. This creates a regulatory context in which broadcasters have a consistent incentive to stay on the right side of political opinion, not because the FCC will necessarily act, but because the possibility that it might creates a reason to avoid attracting attention. Congressional hearings are one mechanism through which political attention is drawn to the industry. When members of Congress speak about television violence or television indecency or television's influence on children, broadcasters listen, because the political environment those statements create shapes the regulatory environment in which they operate. The hearings that addressed television violence in the early 1990s explicitly mentioned The Simpsons, alongside shows like Married with Children, NYPD Blue, and various daytime talk shows as examples of content that had pushed beyond what a congressional majority was comfortable with during family viewing hours. The Simpsons' inclusion in these discussions was partly ironic, because the show's violence was cartoon violence, the elaborate Looney Tunes-style mayhem of Itchy and Scratchy, embedded within a show that the creators had specifically designed to comment on the relationship between cartoon violence and real life. Itchy and Scratchy and Marge was, among other things, a meditation on exactly the kind of concern that congressional hearings on television violence were raising. The episode got included in the hearings anyway. Or rather, the show and the episode were referenced as part of the broader cultural conversation, which is not quite the same thing as being cited as an example of the problem. Several members of Congress who mentioned the show were making a point about the general trend rather than specifically condemning The Simpsons. But the effect was the same as if the condemnation had been specific. The show's name was associated with the congressional concern. It was in the news story alongside the hearings. Parents who read about television violence and congressional oversight read about The Simpsons in the same breath. The V-chip provision that emerged from the mid-1990s television violence debates was the most concrete political outcome of a process that The Simpsons had been cited in. The V-chip is a device required in all television sets sold in the United States after 2000 that allows parents to block programming above a certain content rating. The content rating system TVY, TVY7, TVG, TVPG, TV14, TVMA, was developed by the broadcast industry in response to the political pressure of the hearings. The Simpsons rating for most of its run has been TV PG. This means it is considered appropriate for general audiences but may contain content that parents of young children might want to preview. It is one rating above the most permissive family category and considerably below the adult-only categories. The rating has not prevented children from watching the show. This has been true since the rating system was implemented. Content ratings restrict the theoretical access of children to content. They do not restrict actual access because children watch what is on, and parents do not systematically use V-chip blocking in the way the system anticipated they would. But the existence of the rating gave the show a formal classification within a regulatory system that it had helped create, through the congressional attention it had attracted, through the political energy that had produced the hearings. The show that contributed to the political pressure for a content rating system became one of the first programs to be rated under that system. Let me slow down here for a moment because there's a detail worth sitting with. The people who made The Simpsons in those first years, the writers, the animators, the producers, the voice actors, were trying to make something honest. This is not the framing that most discussions of the show's controversies emphasize, but it is the framing that most accurately describes what was happening. They were not trying to shock. They were not trying to transgress for the sake of transgression. They were not primarily interested in seeing what they could get away with, though there was some of that energy in certain specific decisions. They were trying to make a show that told the truth about family life, the uncomfortable truth that families are not always kind to each other, that parents are not always wise, that children are not always obedient, that the institutions that are supposed to care for people often fail them, that love is real but frequently insufficient against the weight of circumstance. That is a simple and serious artistic intention. And in the context of American primetime television in 1989, it was genuinely revolutionary. The dominant mode of family television was aspiration families who worked through their problems, learned lessons, ended episodes in a slightly better relationship to each other than they started. The Simpsons ended episodes in the same relationship they started, which was chaotic and loving and functional and deeply imperfect. And the point was not that they had failed to grow, but that they had survived, which is the more honest thing. Every controversy the show ever generated was, at some level, a controversy about honesty. About whether the public was allowed to see something true about family life, about institutions, about the world as it actually was, rather than as authority would prefer it to be depicted. The affiliates who would not broadcast Homer's phobia were declining to allow their viewers to see something true about gay people and about the irrationality of fear. The Japanese broadcasters who declined 30 Minutes Over Tokyo were declining to allow their viewers to see an American satire applied to cultural institutions they preferred to see treated with different reverence. The Chinese regulators who excluded references to June 4th were declining to allow their viewers to see a reference to historical events the state had determined could not be acknowledged. The German editors who shortened Bart the General were declining to allow their viewers to see cartoon children organized in military formation. In every case, what was being kept from view was something that was, in some sense, real or that engaged with something real in a way that the gatekeeping institution found incompatible with the image they were trying to maintain. The show was honest. The world's gatekeepers preferred dishonesty, and the show won. The early Season 2 episode, Bart the Daredevil, contains one of the first moments where the show's approach to physical comedy escalated past what had previously been considered the limit of what could be shown on a primetime animated show. Homer, having lectured Bart about the dangers of daredevil stunts and the importance of not attempting to jump over Springfield Gorge on a skateboard, then attempts to jump over Springfield Gorge on a skateboard himself. The sequence that follows Homer missing the jump, falling down the gorge, bouncing off the cliff face repeatedly, landing at the bottom, being loaded into an ambulance, having the ambulance also crash is extended, detailed, and committed to in a way that was unusual for primetime animation. The joke is Homer's hypocrisy, which is the show's most reliable source of comedy. Homer tells Bart to be sensible and then immediately does the exact thing he just told Bart not to do. The physical consequences are severe and play out in full. Homer suffers. The audience laughs at the suffering. Standards and practices reviewed the sequence extensively. The concern was about the extended duration and detail of Homer's suffering, whether it was appropriate for primetime viewing, whether it normalized physical harm as comedic material in a way that could have real-world effects on children who watched it. The creative team argued that the sequence worked precisely because it was extended. The comedy came from the commitment to the bit, from Homer continuing to bounce off the gorge face after the joke had already landed, which produced a secondary joke about the excess of the suffering, which then produced a third joke about whether the sequence was ever going to end. Cut the sequence to its minimum and you lose the layers. Keep it full and you have something that approaches a perfect comedic structure. Standards and practices accepted this argument, with some modifications that the creators have discussed as minor. The sequence aired largely as intended, and it became one of the show's most referenced early moments. The gorge scene, Homer's long descent, the ambulance at the bottom. It is referenced that way because it is genuinely funny and genuinely well constructed. But it exists in the form it exists in because the creative team fought for it, because they made the argument for why the complete version was the correct version and the shortened version would have been lesser, because they knew what they were making well enough to defend it. That is what the early history of the show was. A team of people who knew what they were making, who could articulate why it was worth making that way, and who were willing to have the arguments that were necessary to protect what they knew was right. Bart Gets Hit by a Car from Season 2 involves Homer trying to fake an injury claim against Mr. Burns after Bart is hit by Burns's limousine. The episode depicts personal injury litigation, insurance fraud, and the gap between what lawyers know is true and what they are willing to say in court in a way that was fairly frank about the ethical compromises involved in the legal system. The American Bar Association received letters from some members expressing concern about the episode's depiction of a lawyer here, the ambulance chaser Lionel Hutz, played by Phil Hartman as a figure of almost complete ethical bankruptcy. Hutz is not a satirical exaggeration in the way that most caricatures are. He is a satirical exaggeration in the way that great satire is not a character who is somewhat like bad lawyers, but a character who embodies the specific failure mode of the lawyer as pure mercenary in its most concentrated form. The ABA concern was that Hutz was the only lawyer most viewers of the show would be thinking about. When they thought about lawyers that a caricature repeated in a popular show would shape public perception of the profession in ways that were unfair to the significant majority of lawyers who conducted themselves ethically, this concern was not acted on. The ABA wrote no formal complaint. No affiliates declined the episode. No broadcasters moved it to a later slot. The concern was expressed internally within the legal profession and then, essentially, dissipated. But it illustrates something about the show's relationship to professional identity. The show depicted lawyers, doctors, politicians, police, educators, and religious figures with the same consistent approach. The institution exists, the people within it mostly try to serve the institution's stated purpose, and the gap between the institution's stated purpose and its actual practice is the source of comedy and sometimes of something more uncomfortable than comedy. Every profession that encountered its Simpsons version went through some version of the same cycle. Initial offense, some internal discussion, eventual acceptance that the show's depiction was doing something more interesting than simple slander. The doctors who objected to Dr. Nick Riviera eventually produced academic papers noting that the show's satirical depictions of healthcare accurately identified specific systemic failures. The police who objected to Chief Wiggum's incompetence eventually produced law enforcement training discussions that cited the character as an illustration of what institutional failure in policing looked like. The show was not being unfair, it was being honest. And honest depictions of professional institutions are, in the short term, almost universally unwelcome to the people who work within those institutions and have a relationship to how they are perceived. The relationship between the show and the Fox network evolved significantly between the first season and the fourth. By the end of season 4, the show was the most profitable program Fox had ever produced. Its advertising rates were among the highest on American broadcast television. It had won multiple Emmy Awards. It had generated cultural impact that extended far beyond its own audience. "Don't have a cow, man," was a phrase known by people who had never watched an episode. This success transformed the internal power balance. In season 1, the network held most of the leverage. The show was unproven. The creators needed the network more than the network needed them. The standards and practices process had real teeth. The concerns about Bart's negative influence and Homer's poor fatherhood could, in theory, have reshaped the show significantly. By season 4, the balance had shifted. The show was too profitable to modify in ways the creators did not want. The standards and practices process still existed. The concerns still arose. But the creators' ability to push back had increased enormously, because the argument, "this is what makes the show work, and the show makes us a lot of money," is a very strong argument in the context of American commercial broadcasting. The creative team used this leverage. Episodes in Season 4 and 5 pushed further than anything in Seasons 1 and 2. The satire was sharper. The darkness was darker. The willingness to let Homer fail completely, not just partially, not with a redemptive moment at the end, but completely was more consistent. This is not to say the show became something the network was uncomfortable with. The network was very comfortable with a program that generated the advertising revenue The Simpsons generated. What it means is that the show's artistic ambition and commercial success reached a kind of alignment in the middle seasons that gave the creators unusual freedom within the institutional constraints they were always working within. The constraints were always there. The freedom within them was greater than in the early years. And the show that resulted Seasons 4 through 8, the run that is still most commonly cited as the show's peak, is the product of that particular combination of constraint and freedom. The night of the 17th of December 1989 was a Sunday. The first episode of The Simpsons, the one that aired first, Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, though it was not the first produced, was watched by approximately 26.7 million viewers. This was a significant number. It was competitive with what the other networks were doing that evening. It was enough to confirm that the experiment was working, but the number does not capture what was actually happening. Because what was happening was that a generation of American television viewers was encountering, for the first time, a family that looked like what American families actually looked like. Not aspirational, not idealized, not the perfected version that television had always tried to sell them. A father who drank too much and worked a job he had not chosen and loved his family imperfectly and fiercely. A mother who was patient past the point where patience made sense, and who held everything together through a kind of quiet, exhausted determination that the show respected enormously. A son who was smarter than his grades suggested, and more decent than his behavior let on, and who was looking for something to be good at in a world that kept telling him he wasn't good at anything. A daughter who was too smart for her circumstances and too kind to survive in a world organized around the absence of kindness. A baby who watched everything. 26 million people recognized themselves on that Sunday night. And the things that would spend the next 36 years trying to restrict and manage and ban and edit what the show was saying, all of the institutional forces of control and propriety and standard and practice were encountering something that was already more powerful than they were. Because it was honest. Because 36 years of people kept watching. Because when the credits rolled and the couch gag ended and the Simpsons sat down to watch television together, something real was being described. The things that are real are the hardest to stop. Section 4. The International Edits. What other countries couldn't handle. The story of The Simpsons and international censorship is not primarily a story of dramatic bans and government decrees, though there are some of those. It is largely a story of small, quiet adjustments, a scene removed here, a line of dialogue replaced there, a time slot moved, a cultural reference substituted for something that would land differently in a foreign context. These small adjustments, accumulated across 3 decades of international broadcast, tell a different kind of story than the headline bans. They tell you, country by country and broadcaster by broadcaster, what each audience was considered too sensitive to handle. And when you lay all of them side by side, a picture emerges of the different anxieties that different cultures carry about different things. Germany is a useful place to start, because Germany's relationship with certain categories of content is distinctive enough to be illustrative. Bart the General is Season 1, Episode 5, one of the small early batch that established what the show was going to be. The episode involves Bart being bullied by Nelson, the larger and more aggressive kid who becomes a recurring presence in Springfield's social ecology. Bart's response to being bullied is to organize the other children of Springfield Elementary into a military force. He recruits allies, he trains them, he plans and executes what the episode frames as a military campaign against Nelson. The episode is an explicit parody of war film tropes, specifically the underdog gathers forces genre of military movie that was itself already a kind of parody of something real. The comedy comes from the gap between the scale of the military imagery and the smallness of what is actually being depicted, children having a schoolyard conflict dressed up in the language of combat. The German broadcast of this episode was edited. Several sequences were shortened. The concern of the German broadcaster was about the depiction of children engaged in organized violence, even as obvious comedy, even as clear parody. Germany's post-war broadcasting regulations around depictions of violence and militarism, particularly involving children, were and remain substantially stricter than American equivalents. The episode, which played as broad comedy in the United States, read differently through the filter of German broadcasting law. The law was not responding to the episode's satirical intent. It was responding to the images themselves. A child training other children in military tactics. Children conducting a campaign against an enemy. The imagery triggered the regulatory category regardless of the intent behind it. The irony that the episode is a satire of military culture, that it is mocking the very posture the German broadcasters were worried about it promoting, was noted at the time. The show was saying something critical about the logic of violence and hierarchy. The broadcaster could not see past the images to the argument they were making. This dynamic, the satirical intent of an episode being invisible to the censor who objected to it, would repeat itself many times across the show's international broadcast history. The censor sees the surface. The show was always working below the surface. Japan presented a fundamentally different set of challenges, and these challenges were visible from the first moment the show attempted to enter the Japanese market. The foundational issue was the hands. The Simpsons characters have 4 fingers on each hand. This is true of virtually every character in the show, and the reason is historical. Early animators discovered that drawing 4-fingered hands was faster and cheaper than drawing 5-fingered ones, and that the result was actually cleaner and more readable on screen. 5 fingers on a cartoon hand tend to blur together at standard drawing sizes. 4 fingers are distinct. The convention spread through American animation and became standard. Disney used it. Warner Brothers used it. It became, across decades, simply how cartoon characters looked. In Japan, 4 fingers carried a different cultural weight entirely. In Japanese culture, there is a historical stigma associated with a group known as the burakumin, a social class historically associated with occupations considered ritually impure, who were subject to severe discrimination for centuries. One of the derogatory signs historically used to reference members of this group in certain regional contexts was the gesture of 4 fingers, something that in some traditions indicated membership in the discriminated class. When The Simpsons was being prepared for Japanese broadcast, this was identified as a potential problem. The 4-fingered hands that were a completely neutral animation convention in the United States were, in the Japanese context, potentially readable as a culturally loaded image. The solution adopted for early Japanese broadcasts was to have certain close-up shots of characters' hands reanimated with 5 fingers. This was expensive, labor-intensive, and ultimately inconsistent, because not every shot containing a hand close-up could be identified and corrected before air. The result was that some broadcast versions of early episodes in Japan contained a mix of 4-fingered and 5-fingered characters, which created its own visual strangeness. The practice was gradually abandoned as Japanese audiences became more familiar with the show, and the 4-fingered convention became understood as a visual style choice rather than a cultural signifier. But the fact that it happened at all, that the show's most basic visual element required reanimation for a specific market, illustrates how deeply cultural the experience of watching any piece of media is. What looks neutral in one context is loaded in another. What reads as an animation convention in America reads as something else entirely in Japan. The image is the same. The meaning is different. And the meaning is not in the image. The meaning is in the audience. Bart Gets an F is the Season 2 premiere, and in the United States it remains one of the highest-rated episodes the show ever aired. 33 million people watched it in October 1990, a number that represented a significant portion of the entire American television audience gathered around a single episode of a cartoon that had only been on the air for 1 season. The episode is about Bart failing a history test, praying for snow so he can get a snow day and study more, getting the snow presented as a direct response to his sincere prayer, and then still failing the test, though by less than he would have. It is a gentle episode. It is kind to Bart in a way that not all early Simpsons episodes were. It acknowledges that he is struggling without making him simply a bad person for struggling. The moment where Bart, having failed despite his best effort, breaks down and says something unexpectedly heartfelt to his teacher is one of the earlier season's most genuinely affecting pieces of writing. The show treats his failure with the seriousness it deserves. In Brazil, the episode was held up during the licensing review process before its scheduled broadcast. The concern of the Brazilian licensing authority was about the prayer scene. In the scene, Bart prays for snow. He prays with evident sincerity, kneeling by his bed, asking God specifically and earnestly for the thing he needs. The prayer works. It snows. The show presents the snow as the direct result of the prayer cutting from Bart's sincere request to the immediate appearance of snow with barely any time between. Bart himself recognizes the connection and thanks God. The Brazilian authorities' concern was not that the episode depicted prayer negatively. The concern was the opposite. The episode depicted prayer as transactionally effective in a specific and measurable way. Ask God for something specific and concrete, and receive that specific and concrete thing. The authority worried that this presentation was theologically reductive, that it might lead younger viewers to understand prayer as a mechanism for obtaining desired outcomes, a simplification of the theological tradition they were implicitly representing. This is an unusual objection. The concern about theologically simplistic depictions of religious practice is almost always associated with conservative religious groups objecting to mockery or irreverence. It is rare to encounter a censor who objected to a religious depiction for being too positive in the wrong way, for presenting faith as simpler and more directly rewarded than the authority believed it actually was. The episode did eventually air in Brazil. The delay and review did not prevent broadcast. But the nature of the concern is worth sitting with, because it represents a category of objection that appears rarely in the history of media censorship. The objection not to blasphemy, but to insufficient theological complexity. The United Kingdom's relationship with The Simpsons has been consistently complicated, and much of that complication has centered on alcohol. The Simpsons depicts alcohol consumption constantly and without apology. Homer drinks beer in almost every episode. Moe's Tavern is a recurring location. Characters drink socially, recreationally, habitually, and in times of stress. The show treats all of this as part of the normal texture of adult life in Springfield background rather than subject, the way real adult life is structured around alcohol, without most people regarding that as remarkable. This created scheduling problems in the UK that recurred throughout the show's broadcast history. The BBC, which acquired broadcast rights after the show had already run on Sky One, maintained content guidelines around depictions of alcohol that were calibrated to the time of broadcast rather than to the content itself. The guidelines were not concerned with adults watching a comedy show that involved beer. They were concerned with children watching a comedy show that involved beer at a time when the show was scheduled in or adjacent to family viewing hours. The BBC's guidelines for early evening broadcasting were more conservative about certain content categories than either Sky One's or American broadcast equivalents. Depictions of alcohol consumption that were unremarkable in American primetime became scheduling concerns in certain British time slots. The solution, for the most part, was scheduling adjustment rather than editing. Episodes were moved to later slots. The content was considered appropriate for adult audiences and unsuitable for the periods when children were most likely to be watching, and the response was to ensure it reached only the appropriate audience by controlling when it aired. This approach, time-based rather than content-based restriction, is more nuanced than simple censorship. It acknowledges that the content exists and has value for some audiences, while maintaining that not all audiences are appropriate for all content at all hours. Whether the specific calibration was correct is a separate question, but the approach itself is more considered than the flat prohibitions that applied to some of the episodes we have discussed. Australia's engagement with The Simpsons through its classification system produced outcomes similar to the UK experience, but through a different mechanism. Australia's content classification for television had specific categories with corresponding broadcast restrictions. Content classified in certain ways could not be broadcast before specific hours. Multiple Simpsons episodes were classified in ways that pushed them out of their intended time slots. Homer's Barbershop Quartet is a Season 5 episode and a notable example. The episode parodies the story of the Beatles, with Homer, Barney, Apu, and Principal Skinner forming a doo-wop group that achieves national fame and then falls apart. The parody is detailed, affectionate, and genuinely funny. It captures something true about the Beatles' trajectory even while making it absurd. The episode contains several jokes about substance use, specifically about Barney developing a drinking problem during the group's period of fame, a clear parallel to the Beatles' own experiences. The jokes are observational and slightly melancholy. Barney's trajectory is presented as sad rather than glamorous. In Australia, The substance use jokes fell into a content classification bracket that restricted their broadcast to adult hours. The episode was moved to a later time slot than its American equivalent had aired in. The cumulative picture of Australian classification decisions around The Simpsons is of a regulatory system that took the show seriously as adult entertainment and treated it accordingly, restricting access to adult hours rather than banning it outright. This is not censorship in the dramatic sense, but it is a form of access restriction that shaped who could watch the show in Australia during its first decade of broadcast. Several Gulf state markets that carried the show in the mid-1990s applied their own category of scheduling adjustment to episodes containing content they considered incompatible with regional cultural values. Homer vs. Patty and Selma is a Season 6 episode in which Homer borrows money from Marge's sisters, and the sisters use the debt as leverage over him. There is a subplot in which Bart takes up ballet. The ballet subplot was the element that attracted attention in certain Gulf broadcasting markets. The concern was not with ballet as an art form per se. The concern was with the episode's framing of Bart's relationship to ballet. The episode depicts Bart hiding his skill at ballet because he fears social mockery for participating in something coded as feminine. The episode suggests, fairly clearly, that the social pressure Bart is facing is unfair and damaging to him, and the subplot resolves with Bart being recognized and respected for his skill. This framing that the social pressure against a boy doing something feminine is the problem, rather than the boy doing something feminine being. The problem was in tension with the cultural values certain regional broadcasters were operating within. Several aired the episode with the ballet subplot shortened. Others aired it in full, but in a later time slot. The adjustment was quiet. It was not publicly announced. It was the kind of editorial decision that happens in the background of broadcasting without ever becoming a news story. Most viewers in those markets who watched the episode would not have known anything was missing. But something was missing. A specific kind of argument was missing from their version of the episode. The argument that social pressure to conform to gender expectations is harmful, and that resisting it is reasonable. Section 5. The Edited World. Production decisions you never saw. Before we get to the more dramatic international bans, it is worth spending time on something that most viewers never think about: the gap between what was produced and what aired. The Simpsons has a history throughout its entire run of episodes that were made with specific content that was then altered before broadcast, not because of external pressure in the conventional sense, but because of internal decisions made during the production process and during the review process that every Fox show underwent before air. These alterations are not bans. They are not censorship in the conventional sense. But they represent a version of the same negotiation between what a creative team wanted to make and what the standards and practices process would allow them to show that played out everywhere the show was broadcast. And understanding them helps explain why the show that viewers watched was always slightly different from the show that was written, in ways that were usually invisible. Blood Feud is a Season 2 episode involving a blood donation. Homer's blood type is extremely rare. Mr. Burns needs a transfusion. Bart donates blood to save Burns's life. Burns, initially grateful, subsequently becomes ungrateful in the reliable way of wealthy and powerful men in the show's world. Homer writes an angry letter to Burns and then immediately regrets it and spends the episode trying to recall the letter before it arrives. The episode was produced with a joke in an early scene that referenced a specific medication by name. The reference was specific enough that the show's legal team, during the pre-broadcast review process, flagged it as a potential liability. The joke was removed before broadcast and replaced with a more generic version that still worked, but that lacked the precision of the original. Nobody watching the broadcast version would have known anything was missing. The edit was invisible, but it happened. And it is representative of a kind of invisible editing that occurred constantly throughout the show's production history. Legal reviews. Standards and practices reviews. Notes about specific references, specific product names, specific individuals. The version of the show that aired was always shaped by a layer of institutional review that most viewers never see and never know about. Selma's Choice is a Season 4 episode in which Selma, Marge's sister, reconsiders her decision not to have children. The subplot involves Homer getting food poisoning from a submarine sandwich that he finds in a dumpster and eats anyway, and the food poisoning plays out in considerable visual detail over several scenes. The food poisoning sequences were flagged by the Fox Standards and Practices Department before broadcast. The concern was not about the concept of food poisoning. The concern was about the level of visceral, specific detail with which the animation depicted Homer's gastrointestinal condition. The show's animators, working in a tradition that has always been more physically uninhibited than live-action television, had gone further than standards and practices was comfortable with in showing the physical reality of Homer's state. Several specific shots were cut or modified before the episode aired. The broadcast version lost some specificity, but may have gained in comedic effectiveness because the edits forced the show to suggest rather than depict, which is sometimes the funnier approach. What you imagine is happening is funnier than what you see rendered in full. The cut sequences have been discussed in DVD commentaries and interviews over the years. They do not appear to have been made available publicly. They exist in the memories of the people who made the episode, in production materials that are not publicly accessible, and in the minds of the small number of people who saw the rough cut before the edits were made. Homer Goes to College opens Season 5 and is one of the most deliberately absurdist episodes the show had produced to that point. Homer is required to take college-level nuclear physics courses to maintain his job certification at the plant. He enrolls at Springfield University. The episode sustains a parody of college movie tropes, specifically the Animal House tradition of nerds versus cool guys, with a self-awareness that makes it funnier rather than duller. The episode contains a scene involving a prank at the Springfield University dean's office. Homer and his new college friends rig a prank involving the dean's car. The prank goes wrong. The dean is injured. The original version of this scene, as written and partly animated, was more specific about the nature of the injury. The broadcast version softened the injury to make it clearly non-serious. This was a standards and practices call rather than an artistic one, and the writers have noted in various interviews that they believed the original version was funnier. This is the most common complaint about the invisible edits, not that they removed something genuinely harmful, but that they removed something better. The funnier version was the one that could not air. The version that could air was safer, but less good. There are episodes across every season of the show that contain these invisible adjustments. Jokes that were slightly sharpened before they became too sharp. References that were made more oblique before they became too specific. Images that were softened before they crossed into territory the review process considered problematic. In most cases, the adjustments are small enough that the episode still works and still says what it was trying to say. The show's writers were skilled enough to work around most of what the review process required of them, finding ways to make their points that were harder to object to without being less pointed. But in some cases, the invisible edits removed the best version of a joke. And in those cases, the version of the show that aired was a lesser thing than it needed to be, not because of anything the audience did, but because the review process required a kind of safety that was in tension with the specific quality that made the show's comedy excellent. The show's comedy was excellent because it was unexpected. It surprised you. It said things in ways you had not anticipated and made connections you had not seen coming. All of those qualities are in tension with a review process designed to prevent things that are unexpected from reaching the air. The process and the show's best qualities were always pulling in opposite directions, and the show existed in the tension between them. Section 6. The Gay Episode. Homer's Phobia and What It Cost. Homer's Phobia is Season 8, Episode 15. It aired on the 16th of February, 1997. It won the Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program. GLAAD cited it as one of the most significant pieces of LGBT representation in the history of American television. Multiple Fox affiliates refused to broadcast it. The episode introduces John, a man who runs a vintage kitsch shop in Springfield. He is warm, funny, knowledgeable, and generous with his time and attention. He and Homer meet when the Simpsons visit his shop, and Homer immediately likes him. Homer finds him interesting and funny and genuinely enjoyable to be around, in the uncomplicated, enthusiastic way that Homer sometimes enjoys people when he is not working too hard to decide whether he should. Homer does not initially understand that John is gay. When Homer finds out the information arrives without announcement, John simply mentions a partner or uses a pronoun, and it becomes clear Homer's response is panic. Genuine, escalating, irrational panic. He becomes convinced that John's presence in his children's lives will influence them. He becomes particularly worried about Bart. He takes Bart to a steel mill. The mill is operated by large, muscular men working with intense machinery in an environment that Homer associates with masculine labor. The men at the steel mill turn out to be dancing to disco music after hours. He takes Bart to a deer hunting cabin. The hunters speak in traditionally masculine registers. The hunters turn out to be gay. Every place Homer goes in search of an environment he associates with pure, heterosexual masculinity turns out to contain gay men. The joke is not that gay men are everywhere in a threatening way. The joke is that Homer's mental map of the world, the one that divides spaces into safe and unsafe based on a category that the actual world does not organize itself around, simply does not correspond to reality. The territory he thought was clean turns out to be not what he thought it was, not because it has been contaminated, but because the map was always wrong. John, voiced by John Waters, the filmmaker known for his deliberately transgressive work across decades of American cinema, is the episode's moral center. He is patient with Homer's discomfort. He is aware of it, understands it, and does not seem particularly wounded by it. He has encountered it before, you sense. Many times before. He continues being warm and generous and helpful despite Homer's increasing awkwardness around him. The episode's resolution does not give Homer a clean conversion. He does not emerge from the episode fully accepting and enlightened. What he emerges with is something more realistic, the recognition that John is a good person who helped his family and that this goodness matters more than his sexuality. Homer's feelings have not been entirely transformed. His behavior has changed, which is the change that actually matters. This is unusual for American television of that era. Most 1,997 television that dealt with homophobia resolved it with a character having a sudden and complete change of heart, a recognition of prejudice, and a full abandonment of it. The Simpsons gave Homer something more honest, a partial, grudging, situationally forced acknowledgement that the person he was afraid of was, in fact, better to him than most people. It is a more realistic portrait of how minds actually change, not through single insights, through repeated exposure to evidence that contradicts the fear, until the evidence accumulates past the point where the fear can be maintained in the presence of the specific person it was directed at. The Fox affiliates that refused to broadcast the episode were concentrated in the American South and rural Midwest. Several stations received advance content information about the episode and decided they would not air it. Some explained their decision publicly. Others substituted alternative programming without comment. The affiliates' decisions generated significant press coverage, which, in a classic irony of censorship, produced better publicity for the episode than it would have received if it had simply aired. The fact that some stations were refusing to show a gay-themed episode of The Simpsons made people across the country more interested in seeing it. The episode was discussed in newspapers and on radio. It was referenced in entertainment news. GLAAD issued statements praising the episode and criticizing affiliates by name. In the markets where it did air, the episode received stronger ratings than it might have without the news story surrounding it. People watched it, at least partly, because they had been told some people thought they shouldn't. This is the Streisand effect, named later for a different incident but describing a dynamic as old as censorship itself. Banning or restricting content draws more attention to it than the content would have received on its own. The affiliates who refused to broadcast heterophobia made more people aware of it and more curious about it than the episode would have reached in a quiet broadcast. They amplified exactly what they were trying to suppress. John Waters, responding to the controversy, brought the composed amusement that comes from someone who has spent decades making deliberately provocative work and has developed a philosophical relationship with the discomfort of others. He noted that being the subject of affiliate censorship was entirely consistent with his career trajectory. He had made films, refused screenings. He had made films given ratings that prevented commercial distribution. Homer's phobia was the most widely seen thing he had ever been a part of, which made it somewhat strange that it was also the thing that generated a censorship response. But perhaps not that strange. The larger the audience, the larger the reaction. The story of the episode and its refusal is worth sitting with because 1997 was a specific moment in the longer arc of LGBT rights and representation in the United States. The Defense of Marriage Act had been signed the previous year. In most states, there were no legal protections for gay people in employment or housing or most public contexts. The cultural representation of gay people in mainstream entertainment was still substantially shaped by a set of unspoken rules about what gay characters could be shown doing, how central their sexuality could be to their characterization, and whether their lives could be depicted as fully equal in value and interest to straight lives. Homer's phobia operated around the edges of these rules rather than breaking through them directly. John is gay but not depicted in a romantic relationship. His sexuality is part of who he is but not the whole of who he is. The episode's subject is Homer's fear rather than gay life itself. But even operating at the edges, the episode was too much for some affiliates. The subject was too present. The gay character was too sympathetic. The episode's conclusion that Homer's fear was irrational and the gay character was a good person was too unambiguous for broadcasters, who preferred the conclusion be less clear. What the affiliates were declining to show their viewers was not explicit content. It was an argument. The episode had reached a specific conclusion, and the affiliates did not want their viewers to receive that conclusion. The gay character is the nicest person in the episode. That was the problem. GLAAD's response to the episode was specific and detailed. They noted that what was significant about it was not merely the presence of a sympathetic gay character, but the specific nature of that character's portrayal. John is gay, and John is also funny, warm, generous, knowledgeable, and capable of genuine kindness towards someone who is afraid of him. His gayness is one thing about him rather than the defining sum of him. He is a person who happens to be gay rather than a gay person who exists to demonstrate gay experience. This distinction is subtler than it sounds and more significant than it might seem. The history of LGBT representation in mainstream entertainment up to that point had been substantially a history of characters whose entire existence was organized around their sexuality. The gay character's story was the story of being gay, of coming out, of facing discrimination, of the tragedy of being gay in an unaccepting world. John is not that. John's story in this episode is about being a person who is warm and funny and generous, and who has to deal with a friend who is afraid of him because of something about him that John himself treats as unremarkable. His sexuality is present but not determinative. The show does not treat it as the only interesting thing about him. GLAAD found this significant because the representation they were advocating for was not just the presence of gay characters, but the presence of gay characters who were fully realized human beings, with inner lives and humor and generosity and flaws that existed independent of their sexuality. John was closer to that than most of what had come before in American mainstream television. The broader cultural moment makes the episode's impact worth considering in context. 1997 was several years before the major legal and social changes that would transform the landscape of LGBT rights in America. It was also several years after the AIDS crisis had forced American culture to begin reckoning with gay existence in ways it had previously been able to ignore. The 1990s were a decade of genuine cultural transition around these issues, in which mainstream entertainment was slowly, unevenly, and often awkwardly beginning to engage with gay characters as characters rather than as social problems. Homer's phobia arrived in that transition and said something specific. It said that a gay man could be the most decent person in an episode of America's most popular cartoon. It said that a straight man's fear of gay people was not just wrong, but actively ridiculous, that the gay-free zones Homer tried to find were a fiction. It said these things to tens of millions of viewers, including a substantial number in the markets where affiliates had refused to show it and who would find the episode through other means. The affiliates who refused to air it were trying to prevent their viewers from receiving those messages. They failed. The episode is remembered. The affiliates are not. Section 7 Japan. The 30 Minutes that caused a diplomatic response. The non-broadcast of 30 Minutes Over Tokyo in Japan is the most formally documented censorship action in the history of The Simpsons, and also the one that raises the most interesting questions about what satire owes to the people it is satirizing. The episode is Season 10, Episode 23. It aired in the United States on the 16th of May, 1999. The Simpson family goes to Japan. The travel episode format was, by Season 10, a reliable structure for the show. The family had been to Australia, to England, to France, to Brazil. The formula was consistent. The family arrives somewhere. Their specifically American way of being collides with the specificities of wherever they are. Comedy and occasional genuine cultural observation emerge. Japan was different from the other travel episodes in ways that became clear only when the episode was complete and Japanese broadcasters saw it. The episode's version of Japan is built from several elements. There is a game show sequence involving contestants being subjected to painful and humiliating physical challenges. There are depictions of Japanese consumer culture, Japanese food, Japanese architecture, Japanese social customs, And there is a sequence at the Imperial Palace that involves Homer in physical proximity to the Emperor of Japan. The game show sequence was a parody of a genre that genuinely existed. Japanese game shows of the late 1990s did include physical challenge formats that struck American observers as more extreme than American equivalents. The parody takes this genuine difference and pushes it toward absurdity in the way Simpsons parody usually works, finding the real thing and then amplifying it past the point of credibility for comedic effect. The Emperor sequence was a different matter entirely. In the episode, Homer ends up at the Imperial Palace and interacts with the Emperor in a way that violates the considerable cultural protocols that surround the imperial institution. Homer treats the Emperor with the same free, casual, slightly oblivious irreverence that he treats everyone, the irreverence that is Homer's defining mode of engaging with the world. Applied to his neighbors, to his boss, to celebrities, to presidents, this irreverence is a source of comedy. Applied to the Emperor of Japan, it was not received as funny. NHK Japan's national broadcaster and several major commercial networks declined to broadcast the episode. This was not a government ban. No Japanese regulatory authority declared the episode prohibited. What happened was that the major players in the Japanese broadcast landscape collectively concluded that broadcasting it would be seen as disrespectful to an institution and a figure that their audience held in extraordinary regard. The Emperor of Japan is not simply a head of state in the way that most countries understand the title of head of state. The imperial institution is connected to ideas about Japanese civilization and national identity that extend back more than a millennium. The emperor's symbolic role carries a weight that has no real equivalent in American political life. The Simpsons had depicted American presidents as comedic figures many times. The show's treatment of various presidents of the Clinton era and beyond was consistently irreverent. American democratic culture generally expects and permits this. The president is not above the joke. This is a genuine cultural value, deeply embedded in American democratic tradition. The Emperor of Japan operates under a different cultural framework. Applying American democratic satire's norms to the imperial institution was a category error not because the emperor is above criticism, but because the specific mode of humor being applied was calibrated to an American cultural context and it did not translate. This is the deepest and most honest reading of why the episode was not broadcast in Japan. It is not that Japanese broadcasters were unreasonably sensitive or politically rigid. It is that the humor was made for an audience that did not share the cultural assumptions that made it work. The joke assumed a relationship to imperial authority that Japanese viewers do not have, cannot have, because the institution is connected to their cultural identity in ways the joke ignored. The game show sequence is worth examining in its own right because it sits in a different category than the Emperor sequence. The game shows being parodied in the episode are real. Japanese game shows of the era did involve physical humiliation and challenge in ways that were genuinely distinctive compared to American game shows. Satirizing that is legitimate. The thing being satirized is real. And the satire, even exaggerated, even pushed to absurdity, is engaging with something that exists. The difference between the game show parody and the Emperor parody is the difference between satirizing a cultural practice and failing to understand a cultural institution. Game shows can be satirized. Physical challenge formats can be mocked. These are products of the entertainment industry, designed to be consumed and discussed and judged. They exist to be engaged with. The imperial institution is not a product of the entertainment industry. It is not designed to be consumed and discussed in the way that entertainment is. It occupies a different cultural space entirely, and the rules that govern how entertainment can engage with entertainment do not automatically apply to how entertainment can engage with an ancient institution of this kind. The episode did not distinguish between these two categories. It treated everything Japanese as equally available for the same kind of satirical engagement, and in doing so, it made an error that Japanese broadcasters were not willing to overlook. The episode has never aired on Japanese broadcast television in its original form. The non-broadcast has never been formally reversed. As of available information, the episode remains unavailable through any Japanese broadcast channel. The episode is available in Japan through streaming platforms that carry the international Simpsons catalog, which means Japanese viewers who want to see it can. But the specific gatekeeping function of broadcast television has never allowed it into the broadcast stream. This is, as of available information, the longest-running formal broadcast exclusion in the show's history. Other episodes that were pulled or restricted eventually returned. 30 Minutes Over Tokyo simply never became part of Japanese broadcast television. And the evolution of the media landscape in which streaming has increasingly supplanted broadcast television as the primary medium for consuming the show means the question of broadcast airing may eventually become moot for reasons that have nothing to do with the episode's content. In the years following the episode's non-broadcast, members of the creative team gave interviews addressing the controversy with varying degrees of acknowledgement. The general tone was of mild surprise that had shaded, over time, into something more like understanding. The team knew they were making jokes about Japan. They had done research. They were engaging with specific aspects of Japanese culture rather than using Japan as a generic, exotic backdrop. They were trying to be specific about the place they were depicting. The issue was that the engagement was from the outside. The jokes in the episode are the jokes that an American visitor to Japan would find funny. They are the observations of someone for whom the foreign is strange and therefore funny, who has not fully considered that what reads as charming foreignness from the outside may read differently from inside. What looks strange from the outside is normal from the inside, and what looks funny from the outside may not be funny at all from the perspective of the people being observed. This is not a failure unique to The Simpsons. It describes the vast majority of American entertainment that has engaged with cultures other than its own. American entertainment has a long history of treating other countries as settings and other cultures as material, as backdrops for American stories, rather than as traditions with their own internal logic and their own relationship to how they are represented. What makes 30 Minutes Over Tokyo unusual is not the error itself, but the specificity and formality of the response. The error generated a broadcasting decision that has never been reversed, which means it is still visible decades later as a documented record of what happened when a specific kind of cultural miscalibration met a specific kind of cultural sensitivity. Section 8. China and the Things That Couldn't Be Said. The People's Republic of China and The Simpsons have a relationship that can be described simply. The show has never had significant official broadcast presence in China. Several episodes have been specifically identified as incompatible with Chinese media regulations, and the reasons for this tell you more about Chinese media policy than they do about The Simpsons. The most directly relevant episode for understanding the China situation is Goo Goo Gai Pan, from Season 17, which aired in 2006. The episode involves the Simpson family traveling to China for Selma to complete paperwork for an international adoption. It was produced during a period when The Simpsons had some limited official distribution in China through content licensing arrangements with streaming platforms. That arrangement was fragile, conditioned on the show not producing content that Chinese regulatory authorities found objectionable. Goo Goo Gai Pan produced content that Chinese regulatory authorities found objectionable. The episode's depiction of China included several elements the government's broadcasting regulator flagged. The portrayal of Chinese government bureaucracy was satirical, in a way that suggested the bureaucracy was indifferent and corrupt. The treatment of the adoption process, and of the Chinese officials who administered it, was comedic in ways Chinese regulators read as condescending. The general image of China presented in the episode was not the image the Chinese state wanted projected internationally. But the most significant issue was a reference to Tiananmen Square. In the episode, the Simpson family visits Tiananmen Square. During the scene, there is text or a sign that includes a reference to the events of June 4, 1989, the protests and subsequent military action that ended with the deaths of an unknown number of students and civilians. In China, the events of the 4th of June, 1989 are subject to some of the most thoroughgoing media controls of any historical subject. Coverage, reference, and depiction are not merely restricted. For practical purposes, they are prohibited in Chinese mass media. The Chinese internet is systematically scrubbed of references to the date and the events with a regularity and thoroughness that has been extensively documented by researchers and journalists. The events do not appear in state media. They are not acknowledged in official history. They occupy an official non-space. For a foreign television program to include even a passing reference to those events in a clearly comedic, non-documentary context was something the regulatory framework simply could not accommodate. The reference was not going to be allowed regardless of how it was framed, what surrounding context it appeared in, or how indirect or minimal the reference was. The episode was removed from Chinese distribution. The broader relationship between The Simpsons and Chinese streaming platforms became significantly more cautious after the episode's production. The Tiananmen Square reference illustrates a specific kind of censorship that operates differently from most of what we have discussed tonight. Most Simpsons censorship has been about content that was found offensive, disturbing, or culturally inappropriate in specific ways. The episode was too violent, too irreverent, too sympathetic to gay people, too damaging to a country's international image, too disrespectful to a cultural institution. The censorship of the Tiananmen Square reference is different. It is not about the content being offensive. It is about the content touching a subject that has been placed outside the boundaries of what can be publicly referenced in Chinese media at all. The subject matter itself triggers exclusion. The prohibition is absolute and applies regardless of context, tone, framing, or the nature of the reference. This is the most total form of censorship, not the judgment that something is harmful or inappropriate, but the declaration that a subject cannot be addressed. The episode was not reviewed and found problematic in some adjustable way. The subject matter triggered an automatic exclusion that required no further analysis and admitted no negotiation. Understanding this distinction helps explain why engaging with Chinese media regulation on behalf of content that touches on prohibited subjects is essentially impossible. There is no version of the reference that could have been made acceptable. The subject was not permitted. Discussion ends there. The Principal and the Pauper episode, which we might discuss in another context as the episode that showed Springfield's machinery of collective denial, also has a relevant Chinese distribution history, though less dramatically. The episode's premise, an authority figure revealed to be living under a false identity for decades, was flagged during a review process for a broader Chinese distribution arrangement. The concern was less with the specific plot of the episode and more with the general principle it embodied. Legitimate authority can be delegitimized by the revelation that it was founded on a lie. Chinese media regulation is particularly sensitive to content that depicts authority as potentially fraudulent. The concept of the legitimacy of authority is central to the regulatory framework. Content suggesting that authority might be built on deception, even in a clearly satirical, cartoon context, even in a plot about a fictional school principal, is content that the regulatory framework approaches with caution. The episode was not formally banned, but it was identified as a concern during the broader distribution review, and the outcome of that review was that the arrangement it was part of never fully materialized. The broader question of The Simpsons in China raises something interesting about the relationship between American popular culture and countries with very different media environments. The Simpsons has been seen in China, not through official channels, and not in numbers that could be precisely quantified, but through the informal distribution networks that have always carried foreign content into markets where it was not officially available. The show is known in China among audiences who seek out Western entertainment. The characters are recognizable. References circulate in modified form on Chinese social media platforms, where specific regulatory pressures around content require that references be adjusted or encoded to pass automated review. This means The Simpsons exists in China in a kind of half-light present, but not officially acknowledged. Known but not formally available. Watched but not in the form of the show as it was made. The show that has been everywhere in the world exists in China as something between a rumor and a memory of something seen through unofficial channels. This is not a condition unique to The Simpsons in China. It describes many things in China's media environment. But it is notable for a show whose official international reach is among the most extensive of any television program in history. Section 9 God, Church, and the Show That Talked Back to Heaven. The Simpsons has a complicated relationship with religion. This may be an understatement. The show's Springfield contains a God who exists and occasionally speaks, a church that is simultaneously a community institution and a source of gentle satire, and a cast of characters whose relationships to faith range from devout and earnest to comically negligent, with most falling somewhere in the complicated middle. The show never mocks faith itself. This is an important distinction that is sometimes lost in discussions of the show and religion. What the show mocks is the gap between professed values and actual behavior, a gap that exists as easily in religious life as in secular life. The Reverend Lovejoy is not mocked for believing in God. He is mocked for the ways in which his professional performance of religion has become disconnected from any living relationship to what he professes to believe. Ned Flanders is not mocked for being devout. He is sometimes mocked for the ways in which his relentless well-behavedness seems less like a virtue and more like a psychological constraint. These are subtle distinctions, and they are the kind of subtle distinctions that organized religious groups monitoring media content have historically not always found easy to credit when they encounter the show's irreverence toward religious institutions. Homer the Heretic is Season 4, Episode 3. Homer has a conversation with God, an actual, face-to-face conversation. Homer is sleeping in and decides not to go to church. In a dream, he meets God himself. The God of the episode is genial, specific, and willing to engage with Homer's questions. He is supportive of Homer's decision to find his own path to spiritual connection, rather than attending a service he finds tedious. God tells Homer that not everyone needs to show their devotion the same way. Homer receives this with relief. He spends the rest of the episode happily at home on Sundays while his family goes to church. He cooks elaborate breakfasts, he watches football, he feels, distinctly and sincerely, close to something in these moments of quiet domestic pleasure. The rest of the episode gently complicates this without reversing it. Homer's self-styled home worship eventually leads to a house fire through his carelessness, and it is the community of Springfield, including neighbors he had been avoiding by staying home, who save him and his house. The episode does not conclude that Homer was wrong to find his own path. It concludes that the community provided by organized religion, separate from the formal theology, has value that Homer had been missing by isolating himself from it. This is a sophisticated theological position. It distinguishes between institutional religion and the social fabric that institutional religion weaves. It suggests that you can have a genuine relationship to the divine without participating in the institution, but that the institution exists for reasons that go beyond formal theology, and that those reasons have value too. Religious groups who wrote to Fox about this episode did not receive this reading as sophisticated. They received it as a show that had depicted God endorsing skipping church. The nuance that the episode subsequently complicated that position was, for some viewers, insufficient to counterbalance the image of God, personally telling Homer that skipping church was fine. The Southern Baptist Convention wrote formally to Fox. The letter was received and responded to. The episode was not edited. It aired in every market where the show was broadcast without modification. But the engagement itself, a major American religious denomination corresponding formally with a television network about the theological content of an animated comedy, is worth noting as a marker of how seriously the show was. Being taken by institutions that might have been expected to dismiss it as irrelevant. Bart Sells His Soul from Season 7 is one of the most philosophically ambitious episodes the show produced. And it is the episode that generated the most genuinely theological response from religious viewers, not primarily in anger, but in engagement. The premise? Bart sells his soul to Milhouse for $5. Bart does not believe in souls. He considers the soul a religious fiction rather than a real thing. He takes Milhouse's $5 and hands over a piece of paper on which he has written, Bart Simpson's soul. What follows is the episode's most unusual move. The premise is taken seriously. Things start to feel different for Bart. Not dramatically, not in ways other characters notice. Automatic doors do not open for him. Animals do not respond to him the way they normally do. A dreamlike sequence shows his soul as an empty rowboat drifting on water, going nowhere without him. Bart begins to suspect he was wrong. He wants his soul back. He goes to Milhouse, who has already sold it along. The search for the soul becomes a genuine and earnest quest. Treated with the same emotional register the show applied to Homer's most sincere moments, the register that said, "This thing matters, pay attention." Religious publications after the episode aired gave it considerable positive attention. Theologians writing in Christian magazines noted that the episode engaged with the concept of the soul at a level of seriousness they had not expected from a cartoon. The episode presented the soul not as a supernatural ornament or dogmatic proposition, but as the thing that makes human connection feel real and warm and possible, the thing whose absence makes automatic doors feel like automated. Indifference rather than convenient technology. This is theologically serious engagement. It is not orthodox in any specific tradition, but it touches the concept of the soul at a depth of philosophical engagement that religious writers found worth acknowledging. Some religious groups were less pleased. The premise of a child selling their soul, even treated seriously, even resolved, was considered inappropriate for children's entertainment. The idea that a soul could be exchanged like an object, even within a narrative that treated the exchange as morally serious, was objectionable to viewers who held specific beliefs about the sacredness of the soul and the inappropriateness of depicting it as transferable even fictionally. Several affiliates moved the episode to a later time slot for its initial broadcast. Most aired it in full eventually. The episode has become a reference point in academic discussions of religion and popular culture. It has been cited in papers and books about how secular entertainment engages with religious concepts. It is an example that does not dismiss religion, does not mock it, but engages with it honestly enough to be uncomfortable for anyone who prefers their theological concepts to remain unexamined. The American Family Association's sustained campaign against The Simpsons in the mid-1990s represents the most organized religious challenge the show faced from any single group. The AFA, a conservative Christian advocacy organization, ran a campaign describing The Simpsons as incompatible with Christian family values. The campaign targeted advertisers rather than the network directly. The AFA's strategy, which they had used successfully against other shows, was to write to companies advertising during The Simpsons and encourage them to withdraw their advertising, framing the show as programming that a family values-oriented brand should not want to be associated with. The AFA's campaign against The Simpsons did not work in the way their campaigns against other shows had worked. The reason it did not work is straightforward. The Simpsons was too commercially successful. By the mid-1990s, the show was one of the most profitable programs on American television. Its advertising rates were high. Its audience was desirable to advertisers. The companies that bought time during the show were getting significant return on their investment. The AFA's pressure campaign ran up against the economic reality that the show was making too much money for anyone to be particularly moved by the threat of a small boycott from a politically motivated advocacy group. Some advertisers did pull their spots. Most did not. And the show continued. The failure of the AFA campaign against The Simpsons is worth noting because it represents a moment when the commercial logic of broadcasting and the moral logic of religious advocacy groups came into direct conflict, and the commercial logic won. This would not always be the outcome of such conflicts. For smaller shows with smaller audiences and smaller advertising revenues, organized religious pressure campaigns have sometimes worked. For The Simpsons, the show was simply too profitable. The show's engagement with organized religion also occasionally produced something unexpected: genuine appreciation from religious communities who found in specific episodes a serious engagement with ideas they cared about. In Marge We Trust is a Season 8 episode in which Marge becomes a lay minister at the Springfield church, providing pastoral counseling while Reverend Lovejoy is absent. The episode depicts pastoral care, the work of listening to people in difficulty and helping them find a path forward with genuine seriousness. It is not a satire of pastoral care. It is a depiction of pastoral care as something that matters, as work that requires genuine attention and empathy and the willingness to be present with people who are struggling. This episode was cited in pastoral care training materials by at least one seminary program as an example of how the practice of listening could be depicted to students. The show that had been attacked by the AFA for undermining Christian values was being used in seminary education. The Simpsons' relationship with religion was not one thing. It was many things simultaneously: irreverent and serious, satirical and respectful, critical of institutions, and genuinely interested in the human needs those institutions were built to serve. Expansion B, the episodes that changed everything around them. Every show that runs long enough eventually produces episodes that do not just exist within the show but change what the show is. Episodes that arrive and leave the landscape altered, that create a before and an after, that the writers of subsequent episodes have to reckon with, because the thing has been said now and cannot be unsaid. The Simpsons has several of these. We have already discussed some of them at length, but there are others whose relationship to censorship and restriction and institutional discomfort is worth spending time with, because the resistance they generated tells you something specific about the nerve they touched. Lisa the Iconoclast aired in the Season 7 run that most people consider the show at the peak of its powers. It is a political episode not about current political figures or parties, but about something that cuts deeper than that: the relationship between civic myth and civic truth, and the question of what communities owe to the myths that organize them. The episode's premise: Lisa discovers evidence that Jebediah Springfield, the legendary founder of their town, was not who the official history says he was. The records Lisa finds suggest that the real Jebediah Springfield was a murderous pirate, that the stories about him were fabrications, and that the entire civic identity of Springfield rests on a historical lie. Lisa, being Lisa, cannot simply not act on what she knows. She launches a campaign to expose the truth. She presents the evidence, she makes the case, and Springfield, confronted with the evidence that their founding myth is false, responds with denial, anger, and eventually a collective decision to maintain the myth. The resolution Lisa reaches is complicated and worth stating precisely. She discovers at the last moment that one piece of her evidence, the one she was going to use as the definitive proof, is itself inconclusive. She could still make the case, but she would not be certain. And standing in front of the crowd ready to speak, she decides not to. Not because the myth is true, but because the myth is what the town needs, and what the town needs matters, and Lisa is wise enough in this moment to understand that. This is a morally sophisticated position that the show takes seriously without fully endorsing. The episode does not say that myths are as good as truth. It does not say that civic lies are acceptable. It says that the relationship between what is true and what a community can bear to know is more complicated than simple truth-telling allows for, and that wisdom sometimes looks like knowing which truths to tell when. The episode generated significant discussion in conservative media, not because of anything in the episode that was explicit or inflammatory, but because of what the episode's premise implied about the nature of American national mythology. The argument that civic founding myths might rest on historical fabrication, that the stories a community tells itself about its origins might be constructions rather than facts, was read by some commentators as an attack on American historical identity. This was not the episode's target. The episode's target was Springfield. But Springfield is America, and so the critique landed somewhere real. Fox Standards and Practices reviewed the episode with particular care. The concern was less about any specific content and more about the political implications of the episode's central argument, whether the show was making a statement about American history that could be characterized as politically partisan. The episode aired without modification, but the review process for it was more extensive than for most episodes. The show had learned to navigate the review process, but Lisa the Iconoclast pushed into territory where the navigation was genuinely uncertain. Homer's Enemy is one of the most philosophically unusual episodes the show produced, and one of the most discussed among the people who think seriously about what the show was doing in its peak years. The premise: Frank Grimes arrives at the Springfield nuclear power plant. He is a new employee. He is competent, hardworking, and exactly the kind of person who should succeed in any merit-based environment. He has overcome significant hardship. He grew up in poverty, educated himself, worked his way into a respectable job through genuine effort. Frank Grimes encounters Homer Simpson and recognizes immediately that Homer represents a complete refutation of the meritocratic principle. Homer is incompetent. Homer is lazy. Homer has survived 32 years of spectacular professional failure without consequence. Homer has a house, a family, a boat, and the unearned contentment of a man who has never had to work hard at anything. Frank Grimes cannot accept this. He cannot understand how the world can contain both Homer and himself, how someone who works hard and demonstrates competence can be worse off than someone who has never demonstrated either. He makes it his mission to expose Homer as the fraud he is. He fails. Homer is too oblivious to be embarrassed. The other characters at the plant, like Homer, Mr. Burns, inexplicably loves Homer. The world of Springfield is organized in ways that make Homer's continued survival not just possible, but somehow appropriate. Frank Grimes goes mad. He begins to mimic Homer doing the irresponsible, idiotic things Homer does. He grabs live electrical wires in the climactic scene, mimicking Homer grabbing things without care, not having Homer's inexplicable invulnerability. He dies. At his funeral, Homer falls asleep and talks in his sleep, which makes the assembled mourners laugh. The episode ends on laughter. This is a dark episode. It is one of the darkest things The Simpsons ever produced. The argument it makes implicit but clear is that merit does not produce reward, that the world is organized to protect people like Homer and destroy people like Frank Grimes, and that the people who struggle hardest and deserve the most are the ones the system grinds up. Fox Standards and Practices flagged the ending. The concern was about Frank Grimes' death, the specificity of it, the fact that he grabbed live wires in a deliberate imitation of Homer, and the way the episode treated his death as essentially comic. The episode's tone did not offer any softening. Frank Grimes died because the world was unfair, and the show made no effort to suggest that this was other than exactly what happened. After an extended review process, the episode aired without modification. But the review notes from that process, which have been discussed in interviews with the creative team, reflect genuine institutional discomfort with an episode that refused the comfort of a redemptive reading. There was no redemptive reading available. Frank Grimes was dead. Homer was asleep at the funeral, making everyone laugh. The world had produced this outcome and showed no sign of feeling bad about it. The episode aired, and it became one of those episodes that people who take the show seriously cite as evidence of what the show, at its best, was actually doing. Not providing comfort. Describing the world. Describing the specifically painful truth that the world does not reward what we tell ourselves the world rewards. The Cartridge Family from Season 9 aired in November 1997 and remains the episode most often cited when the show's relationship to the American gun debate is discussed. The episode involves Homer buying a handgun. He wants it for home protection. The process is depicted accurately: a waiting period, a background check, the bureaucratic reality of legal gun purchase in the United States as it existed in the late 1990s. Homer gets the gun. He is terrible with it, irresponsible, careless in ways that are both funny and frightening. He uses it for things guns should not be used for. He endangers his family. He has an encounter with the NRA. The NRA scenes are the most carefully written in the episode. The show does not simply portray the NRA as villainous. It portrays the organization as a group of people who have a genuine relationship to firearms and the culture around them, who have reasonable things to say about responsible gun ownership, and who are also completely incapable of addressing Homer's specific irresponsibility because the culture around guns does not have mechanisms for dealing with Homer. The critique is structural rather than personal. It is not that the NRA members are bad people. It is that the system they advocate for does not address the specific failure mode that Homer represents. Marge ultimately demands that Homer give up the gun. He agrees. He secretly keeps it. The episode ends in a way that is not fully resolved. Marge thinks the gun is gone, Homer knows it is not, and the camera lingers on this knowledge before the credits roll. The National Rifle Association wrote to Fox. The letter expressed concern about the episode's one-sided depiction of gun ownership. Several Fox affiliates in states with high rates of gun ownership received pressure from local gun rights advocates to decline the episode or, at minimum, to not promote it. Most affiliates aired the episode. Several in specific markets adjusted their promotion. They did not advertise it with clips that highlighted the most critical moments. The episode reached its intended audience. What is interesting about the response to this episode is its restraint compared to what might have been expected. The NRA letter was formal but not aggressive. The affiliate pressure was real but not extensive enough to prevent broadcast. The episode was politically contested territory. The gun debate in the late 1990s was as heated as it has ever been, and the show walked into the middle of that territory with a fairly pointed argument. That the response was relatively restrained says something about the show's commercial position by Season 9. The show was too embedded in American culture by then to be easily targeted. Calling for a boycott of one of the most popular shows on television is a more difficult proposition than calling for a boycott of something smaller. The show's size protected it. Its ubiquity was armor. Marge versus the monorail is not typically discussed in the context of censorship or restriction, because it never was. But it belongs in the story of the show's relationship to institutional authority, because of what it says about that authority and how directly it says it. The episode Season 4, written by Conan O'Brien in one of his final contributions to the show, before leaving to take over late night, involves a con man named Lyle Lanley, who convinces Springfield to spend its entire municipal budget on a monorail. The monorail is shoddily built, poorly designed, and potentially fatal. The citizens of Springfield vote for it unanimously based on nothing more than an enthusiastic sales pitch and a musical number. The episode is, explicitly, a satire of civic credulity, of the tendency of communities to make large, expensive, potentially catastrophic decisions based on charisma and spectacle, rather than evidence and planning. It is specifically a satire of the tendency of American cities in the late 1980s and early 1990s to undertake massive public works projects as civic renewal gestures without adequate planning or oversight. The episode also contains what is probably the most explicit musical number the show ever produced about the mechanism of con artistry, how the pitch works, what psychological levers it pulls, how rational people can be moved to irrational decisions through the careful application of entertainment and excitement. Lyle Lanley is not a mystery. The show shows you exactly how he is manipulating Springfield. The citizens of Springfield watch the same evidence the audience watches and vote for the monorail anyway. This is not a comfortable satire. It says something direct about the relationship between civic culture and the ease with which civic culture can be manipulated. It says that intelligence is not sufficient protection against a well-constructed sales pitch. It says that the desire to believe something is more powerful than the evidence against believing it. No censor objected to this episode. It was too well written to object to. The satirical argument was too clearly constructed, too precisely targeted, too obviously relevant to be easily characterized as offensive or inappropriate in the categories censors work with. But the argument it makes is more radical than many episodes that were restricted or banned. It tells you that your civic institutions are vulnerable to fraud, that the people who are supposed to protect you from fraud are themselves vulnerable to fraud, and that the structure of democratic decision-making provides no reliable protection against a charismatic liar with a good song. That is a difficult thing to say. The show said it in 1993, and it has not stopped being true. Last Exit to Springfield is Season 4, Episode 17, and it is the episode most commonly cited when people who care about the show talk about what it was capable of at its best. Homer becomes the head of the Nuclear Plant Workers Union and leads a strike. The episode is simultaneously a parody of gangster movies, a genuine engagement with the history and mechanics of American labor organizing, a comedic exploration of Homer's specific incompetence being inadvertently effective, and a deeply moving story about Lisa's need for dental care. The dental subplot Lisa needs braces. The plant's dental plan is being eliminated as part of the contract negotiation. Homer's decision to go to the mat for the dental plan is driven by love for his daughter, rather than any abstract principle gives the episode its emotional engine. Homer is not a good union leader. He does not understand the principles of collective bargaining. He does not understand what he is negotiating for or why. But he understands that Lisa needs braces, and that understanding is enough. The episode's engagement with labor history is genuine. References to specific moments in American labor organizing are accurate. The show's writers, several of whom had graduate-level educations, knew what they were writing about. The comedy does not require ignorance of the history. It knows the history and uses it. Fox Standards and Practices reviewed the episode. The concern, which was relatively minor, was about the episode's treatment of organized labor and whether it was advocating a political position. The show's position, insofar as it had one, was that labor organizing was a legitimate historical practice that had produced real material benefits for working people, and that the power of organized capital to resist those benefits was significant but not inevitable. This is not a neutral position in American political terms. The review resulted in the addition of one brief scene that was not in the original script, a moment that added some ambiguity to the episode's treatment of the labor management dynamic. The creative team negotiated this addition. They had leverage. The episode aired. The addition is visible if you know to look for it. It is a moment that softens the episode's clearest argument slightly. The creative team has discussed it in interviews with the specific tone of people who accepted a compromise they did not love. They did not love it because it made the episode slightly less than it could have been. But slightly less than it could have been, and the greatest half hour of American television in the 1990s are not mutually exclusive. The episode remains what it is. The slight softening is there if you look. The argument is there if you look harder. Scenes from the class struggle in Springfield from Season 7 contains the show's most sustained engagement with class as a category. The episode involves Marge acquiring a designer outfit at a discount store and using it to integrate the Simpson family into Springfield's upper-class social world at a country club. The episode's treatment of class is precise and not gentle. The country club set are not simply snobs, they are people who have organized their lives around the maintenance of class distinction and who experience the presence of the Simpsons as a threat to that organization. Their hostility to the Simpsons is not personal, it is structural. It is the response of people who understand, correctly, that their status depends on keeping people like the Simpsons out, and that letting the Simpsons in would begin a process of dilution that they cannot afford to permit. Marge changes herself to fit in. She alters her behavior, her presentation, her relationship to her family in ways that produce growing discomfort across the episode. The episode's final movement is her realization that the self she has been performing is not her, and that performing it is costing her something she cannot afford to lose. This is a fairly radical critique of the aspiration to class mobility, the dominant American dream narrative that says the goal is to move up, to acquire the markers of a higher class, to become something different from what you were. The episode says, this process requires you to stop being who you are, and who you are is the thing worth keeping. No censors objected to this episode. It flew under the radar of the kind of attention that produced formal complaints because it was not about content in the categories that formal complaints address. It was not violent or sexual or religiously offensive or disrespectful to a foreign government. It was simply true, and truth about class in America does not typically generate formal complaints, because the people who would complain about class critique are not the people who write formal letters to Fox. But the episode was doing something genuinely uncomfortable. It was saying that the aspiration to class mobility is a trap, that the price of moving up is giving up what makes you you, that the Simpsons in the country club are lesser versions of themselves, and that returning to being exactly who they were, the family that cannot afford the membership, the family that does not know which fork to use, is the episode's happy ending. That is not a comfortable thing to say in America. The show said it without ceremony and without self-congratulation, and the audience watched and understood and went on watching. There is something worth saying about the cumulative effect of these episodes, taken together as a body of work. Each episode considered individually is a discrete narrative. A specific set of characters, a specific situation, a specific set of jokes, a specific resolution. Each episode can be watched and understood on its own, without reference to anything else. But the episodes accumulate. Watching them in sequence or in the non-sequential way that syndicated television produces, where you might watch Season 4 on a Tuesday and Season 7 on a Friday, something builds. A picture of Springfield that is more than the sum of any individual episode's contribution to it. Springfield, across the cumulative body of work, is a place where labor is exploited and working people accept their exploitation with barely adequate rewards and barely sufficient complaint. It is a place where class is real and mobility is not what the official narrative says it is. It is a place where institutions fail the people they claim to serve and no one is particularly surprised. It is a place where myths are constructions and the constructions are maintained because the truth is worse than the lie. It is a place where the people at the bottom are smarter than the people above them and less free to express it. These themes do not appear in any single episode as a manifesto or a declaration. They emerge from the accumulation of stories told honestly, in which what is true tends to show up across hundreds of episodes of careful and specific observation. The censors who engaged with individual episodes were trying to manage the surface of specific content. They were not engaging with the cumulative argument, because the cumulative argument is not in any one episode. It is in all of them together. And you cannot ban the cumulative argument. You can only ban episodes. The argument continues. Expansion C, the voice actors and the lines they were asked to read. Behind every episode, before any censor ever saw a frame, there was a recording session. The voice actors came in, they read the lines, they made choices, and occasionally the lines they were reading were lines that someone in the room, a writer, a producer, the actor themselves thought might be too much. The voice recording process is an important and under-examined dimension of the show's relationship to its own limits. Because the voice actors were often the first people to encounter a line in its full form, and their response to that line could shape what happened to it. Dan Castellaneta, who voices Homer among several other characters, has discussed in interviews the process of finding what lines would work and what lines crossed something that felt wrong, even in the context of a comedy show. Castellaneta is an actor with a theater background and a genuine feel for what a character would and would not say, for where Homer's specific kind of self-absorption shades into something that is no longer funny because it has become something else. There are lines in scripts, he has suggested, that he read in the recording booth and flagged not to producers as formal objections, but as questions about whether the line was serving the episode or working against it, whether it was an extension of what was already true about Homer, or a departure from it that would feel false, whether the audience would laugh, or whether they would feel something shift in an uncomfortable direction. These are not censorship conversations. They are craft conversations. The distinction matters. The actor is not saying this is inappropriate. The actor is saying this does not feel right for the character. The flagged line goes back to the writers. Sometimes it stays. Sometimes it is revised. Sometimes the actor's instinct is wrong and the original line is better. Sometimes the actor's instinct identifies something that was wrong that nobody else had caught. The end product, the episode as broadcast, is the result of all of these conversations. The writer's instinct, the producer's review, the network's standards and practices process, the actor's read of whether the line was true. All of these pressures shaped what you heard. The actor's voice was just the final link in a chain that extended from the original intention through many hands and many conversations. Julie Kavner, who voices Marge, has spoken less publicly about the recording process than some of her castmates. What she has said suggests a relationship to Marge that is unusually protective, a sense of responsibility for the character's authenticity and the audience's relationship to her. Marge is, in a way that is easy to miss, the moral center of the show. Not in the sense that she is always right or always good. She is not a morality figure. She is the person in the family who is most consistently aware of what the family needs in order to be a family, and who does the work of providing that, and who does it without acknowledgement and without complaint and without the recognition that what she does is genuinely difficult. The episodes that have Marge as their central character tend to be the ones where the show comes closest to a certain kind of honesty about what it costs to hold a family together. Marge versus the monorail, scenes from the class struggle in Springfield, the episodes where Marge considers what she might be if she were not this wife and mother and person who holds things together. These are the episodes that touch something that feels more personal than the show's usual register. Kavner's protective relationship to Marge's authenticity presumably shaped, in small ways, the lines that Marge spoke and the way she spoke them. Not through formal objection, but through the kind of deep inhabitation of a character that means you know when something is wrong, even when you cannot articulate why. Phil Hartman voiced two recurring characters in the show's middle years, Lionel Hutz and Troy McClure. Both were characters built entirely from the architecture of a specific kind of social fraud, the failed professional who maintains the surface of competence through performance. Hutz is a lawyer who has no idea what he is doing. McClure is a B-list celebrity of the 1970s who continues to maintain the persona of relevance through the power of his own sincerity. Both characters are built on the specific pathos of people who are performing a version of themselves that no longer exists, sustaining an identity through the performance of it because the alternative is too painful to contemplate. Hartman brought something specific to both characters, a complete commitment to the performance of sincerity that made both characters genuinely funny, and also, in a way that was easy to miss, genuinely sad. Hutz believes he is a good lawyer. McClure believes he is still someone. The gap between what they believe and what they are is the source of the comedy, but Hartman played them from inside the belief, not from outside it. He never winks. He never signals that he knows the character is pathetic. He plays it straight, which makes it funnier and also makes it something beyond funny. There are specific lines in specific Lionel Hutz episodes that the writers have discussed as being sharper in Hartman's performance than on the page. Lines that were funny when written but funnier when delivered because of something Hartman added to them, a specific pause, a specific quality of misplaced confidence, a specific way of making the character's delusion feel inhabited. This is the thing about the show that no standards and practices process could ever address. The specific contribution of specific actors to making specific lines do more than they did on paper. The words could be reviewed. The intention could be assessed. But the specific thing that happened when Phil Hartman said the words in the specific way that only Phil Hartman could say them, that was beyond the reach of any review process. When Hartman died in 1998, the characters died with him. Not because other actors could not voice them, because the characters were, in some deep sense, performances of Phil Hartman's specific relationship to the kind of person Hutz and McClure were, and that relationship was his, not the characters, and could not be duplicated. The show retired both characters. Hutz and McClure disappeared from Springfield without announcement or ceremony. They just stopped appearing, and viewers who had loved them understood without being told why they were gone. Yeardley Smith has voiced Lisa from the beginning, and the conversation about Lisa's voice is relevant to the subject of restriction and censorship in an indirect way. Lisa's voice, high, slightly thin, earnest, and vulnerable in equal measure, was and is an unusual choice for the character the show was trying to create. Lisa is the smartest character in the family. She is wise beyond her years. She is the character most likely to be making the argument the show wants the audience to take seriously. The voice does not signal any of this. The voice signals a child, a young girl, small and uncertain. And the gap between what Lisa's voice signals and what Lisa's mind contains is, in a quiet way, a structural joke that the show runs continuously without ever quite calling attention to it. Lisa makes the most sophisticated argument in the room in a voice that makes the argument easy to dismiss. She says the true thing that no one wants to hear in a register that allows people not to hear it if they do not want to. Her message is important. Her delivery is easy to overlook. This is, arguably, something the show understood about how intelligence operates in the real world, particularly female intelligence, particularly child intelligence. The things that make you easy to dismiss are often inseparable from the things that make you correct. Being small and young and female makes Lisa's correctness easier to ignore, which makes the episodes about her being ignored more pointed and the episodes about her finally being heard more powerful. No censor ever engaged with this structural element. It is too quiet to object to. It operates at the level of the show's grammar rather than its content. But it is there, and it has been doing work across the entire run of the show. Harry Shearer voices Mr. Burns among his many characters, and his very public discomfort with the principal and the pauper. The Armin Tamzarian episode is worth dwelling on in the context of this discussion. Shearer objected to the episode on the grounds that it violated the internal integrity of a character who had been built across 8 seasons. Principal Skinner had an established identity, an established history, an established set of relationships. The revelation that all of this was false, that Skinner was not Skinner, but someone else who had been performing Skinner, destroyed, in Shearer's view, what had made the character worth caring about. Shearer's objection was not about censorship. It was about authorship, about the responsibility the show had to its own characters and its own internal reality. He was arguing that certain things, once established about a character, could not simply be unmade without consequence for the audience's relationship to that character. The production team disagreed. They made the episode. Shearer voiced it, as a professional, while maintaining his objection publicly. What is interesting about this moment in the context of censorship is that it represents a form of internal resistance that is distinct from any external pressure. Shearer was not concerned about what the episode said about the world. He was concerned about what the episode said about the show, about its relationship to continuity, to integrity, to the ongoing fictional reality it had constructed over nearly a decade. This kind of internal resistance the actor or writer who says this is wrong for the show, not just wrong in general, is a form of quality control that operates entirely differently from the external pressures of censors and critics and pressure groups. It comes from people who know the work intimately enough to recognize when it has gone wrong in a specific way. Shearer was right about the episode. Most people who have thought seriously about it agree that it damaged something in the show's internal reality. The episode is still regularly cited as a low point, not because of what it was saying about the world, but because of what it did to a character the audience had spent 8 years investing in. The show made the episode anyway. And Shearer's objection is part of the record, a marker of the moment when the internal reality of the show and the decision-making of its production team came into conflict in a way that left a visible scar. There is a kind of memory that long-running television accumulates that is not quite like any other kind of memory. The memory is distributed. It exists in millions of individual viewers who hold specific episodes in specific ways. It exists in the episode files themselves, in the archival copies that are stored in production vaults, and in the DVD releases that put the show into physical form that could be held and owned. It exists in the performances of the actors who gave voice to the characters across decades. It exists in the written scripts and the production notes and the standards and practices memos and the affiliate decisions and the diplomatic complaints and the academic papers and the fan theories and the Reddit threads and the clips that circulate on social media long after the context that produced them have changed. All of this is the memory of the show. And all of the attempts to restrict and ban and edit and delay and prevent the show from reaching its audience, all of those attempts are part of that memory too. The censored episodes are remembered partly as censored episodes. The controversy around them is part of what they are. Homer's Phobia is the episode the affiliates would not show. Stark Raving Dad is the Michael Jackson episode that was pulled. 30 Minutes Over Tokyo is the Japan episode that Japan would not broadcast. These are their identities now, shaped as much by the resistance they generated as by the content they contained. The censor does not just restrict, the censor inscribes. In trying to make something unseen, they make it unforgettable. Section 10 Blame It on Lisa, the Brazilian incident. In February 2002, an episode of The Simpsons aired in the United States that generated the most formally significant governmental response to the show in its entire history. Blame It on Lisa involves the Simpson family traveling to Rio de Janeiro because Lisa has been sponsoring a Brazilian orphan and has not heard from him. The family goes to Brazil to find out what happened to the child. The episode uses Brazil as a setting for a series of comedic situations, several of which drew on simplified representations of what Brazil and Brazilians are like. Homer is kidnapped by a cab driver almost immediately upon arrival. The family spends the episode trying to find Homer while navigating a version of Rio de Janeiro that is depicted as colorful, chaotic, and fairly dangerous. Within weeks of the episode's broadcast, the Brazilian Tourism Board filed a formal complaint with Fox. The tourism ministry released public statements to the press. Minister Caio Luiz de Carvalho made several comments that were covered in Brazilian newspapers and in international wire services. The Brazilian government stated that it reserved the right to pursue legal remedies for damage to its tourism industry. The formal complaint identified several specific elements of the episode. The depiction of Rio de Janeiro as a city where kidnapping tourists was common and casual was considered false and damaging to the country's international reputation. A sewer rat depicted as being unusually large was read as a commentary on urban sanitation. Street children portrayed as pickpockets targeting tourists was considered offensive. A monkey in the episode wore clothing considered culturally insensitive. The general presentation of the country was considered to paint Brazil as a dangerous and incompetent place unworthy of tourism. Fox responded with a statement defending the episode as satire and noting that the show regularly depicted American cities and American institutions in satirical and unflattering ways that the treatment of Brazil was consistent with the show's approach to every place it visited. The statement expressed regret for any offense caused without conceding that the episode had been inappropriate. The legal threat was never pursued. The Brazilian government did not file a lawsuit. The formal complaint was absorbed into the diplomatic category of things said publicly without being acted on. The episode continued to air in the United States and most other markets. But the nature of the objection is worth understanding in detail because it is different from most of what the show had encountered before. Most objectors to Simpsons episodes said the show was wrong. Wrong about religion, wrong about morality, wrong about social values, wrong to depict certain things at all. The Brazilian government's objection was different. The government said the show was economically harmful to a specific industry in a way that could be quantified. The argument was not about the episode's moral content. It was about its projected financial effect on Brazilian tourism. This is a different category of objection, and it reflects a specific political context. Brazil in 2002 was in an election year and an economic difficult period. The government was actively investing in promoting Brazil internationally as a destination for tourism and investment. An episode of one of the most watched shows in the world depicting Rio de Janeiro as a place where tourists got kidnapped in the first 20 minutes was directly contrary to the messaging the government was spending significant money to project. The formal complaint was partly a domestic political act, a government showing its constituents that it was defending the country's reputation on the international stage. The timing and specificity of the objection both suggest that the complaint was not purely about the episode's content, but about the political moment it landed in. Fox's consistency argument that the show treats everywhere the way it treats Springfield is both true and slightly incomplete. The argument is true in the sense that the show does apply a consistent satirical approach across American and non-American settings. The show is not harder on Brazil than on Springfield. The satirical mode is consistent. The argument is incomplete in an important way. When The Simpsons satirizes Springfield, it is satirizing a fictional place it invented and fully controls. Springfield's residents are the show's own creation. Their characteristics are the show's chosen exaggerations. The show's depiction of Springfield is making no claims about any real place or real people. When the show depicts Brazil, it is making choices about a real country with real people who have no input into how they are represented and who live in a world where the entertainment media's depictions of their country shape how the rest of the world perceives it. The consistency of the satirical approach does not change the fundamental difference between the two kinds of subject. This does not resolve the question of whether the episode was appropriate. It just means that the consistency argument does not fully address the Brazilian government's objection, which was not about the episode being inconsistently unfair, but about the episode being genuinely harmful in measurable economic terms to a real country and its real people. The question the Brazilian complaint raises, without quite resolving, is what satire owes to the people it depicts. The Simpsons had depicted Australia as a land of enormous animals and casual brutality and beer. It had depicted France as a land of rude waiters and excellent cheese. It had depicted Japan as a land of extreme game shows and imperial reverence. None of those governments had filed formal diplomatic complaints. Why Brazil responded differently is partly about the specific content of the episode. The kidnapping in particular struck Brazilian officials as damaging, because kidnapping tourists was a specific and documented problem in Rio at the time, and the episode's casual treatment of it felt like it was making light of something that was genuinely hurting the country's reputation. A country being laughed at for a real problem it was actively trying to address feels different from a country being laughed at for a cultural stereotype that is mostly harmless. There is also the question of proportion and power. When a show produced in one of the world's most powerful cultural markets makes jokes about a country with less global cultural influence, the jokes travel in one direction. Brazilians can make all the jokes they want about American culture, but those jokes will not reach 30 million American viewers, the way an American joke about Brazil will reach Brazilian viewers and international audiences who will now carry a specific comic image of Brazil with them. The Simpsons existed inside a global cultural power asymmetry that most of its makers probably never thought about, because you do not think about power when you have it. The Brazilian government was on the other end of that asymmetry and was acutely aware of it. Section 11: The Treehouse of Horror Problem. Every year, usually in late October, The Simpsons airs a Treehouse of Horror episode. These are anthology episodes containing 3 separate horror stories that parody classic horror and science fiction tropes. They are the show's annual acknowledgement that the usual rules do not apply, that for one episode, the characters can die, reality can dissolve, and the normal continuity of Springfield can be cheerfully suspended. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are beloved. They are also the episodes that have generated the most consistent and widespread difficulties in international broadcast. The reason for both of these things is the same. They are designed for a specific cultural context that does not exist everywhere the show airs. The episodes are made to be watched in the emotional frame of Halloween, a cultural moment that provides a shared understanding of horror as something you engage with recreationally, communally, and with a certain knowing lightness. The horror of Treehouse of Horror is horror in quotation marks. It is horror that knows it is horror, that is performing horror, that expects its audience to bring the frame of playful engagement with them. This works automatically in the United States because Halloween is deeply embedded in the cultural calendar. The audience brings the frame. The darkness is read through it without effort. When the episodes air in countries where Halloween does not carry that cultural weight, where it is a recent and somewhat shallow import rather than a deep tradition, the frame is not available. The audience has to process the content without the cushioning context. What reads as playful darkness in an American Halloween context reads as something that needs more careful handling in a market where Halloween is not a shared cultural reference. Treehouse of Horror V aired on the 30th of October 1994. It is generally considered one of the best in the series, partly because each of its 3 segments is genuinely excellent. The Shining parodies The Shining. Homer takes a job as winter caretaker of a resort. He is isolated with his family. The isolation begins to affect his mind. He becomes menacing. The parody is close enough to the source material to work as both a joke and a genuine miniature horror story. Time and Punishment has Homer traveling through time using a malfunctioning toaster. Every alteration he makes to the past creates a different and usually worse present. He keeps trying to get back to normal Springfield. He achieves something close to normal but with one detail wrong, and the episode suggests he decides to live with it. Nightmare Cafeteria involves the teachers of Springfield Elementary solving a budget crisis by eating the students. The segment is framed as institutional horror, with a specific satirical target, the school, as a place that consumes children rather than nurturing them, operating on the logic that students are a resource to be utilized rather than people to be served. It is simultaneously funny and genuinely unsettling in the way that good horror should be. Several European broadcasters flagged the episode. The concern, most specifically with Nightmare Cafeteria, was that the combination of children, authority figures, and cannibalism, even in obviously comedic context, fell into a content category that, under relevant broadcasting standards, required a later time slot than the episode had been assigned. The concern was not that the segment was realistic. Nobody watching it would have concluded they were seeing anything but a comedy bit. The concern was classificatory. This combination of elements triggered a content category that restricted broadcast timing. Multiple markets moved the episode. In the UK, the BBC's initial scheduling was revised. In several other European markets, the episode aired in later slots than planned. The episode aired in all its intended markets, eventually. The content adjustments were to timing rather than to the episode itself. No edits were made. But the consistent pattern of time slot adjustment across multiple markets tells you something about how the Treehouse of Horror episodes interact with international broadcast standards. Treehouse of Horror 4, from 1993, contains The Devil and Homer Simpson, the first of the anthology's Faustian bargain stories. Homer sells his soul to the devil for a donut. The devil in this episode is Ned Flanders. Homer eats the donut. Fully aware of what he has traded, in a moment of delirious donuts, before eternity logic. The transaction is complete. The soul has been exchanged for pastry. The premise is pure comedy and pure Simpsons, the most consequential transaction in human mythology, applied to Homer's most characteristic desire, with his most irritatingly virtuous neighbor playing the role of cosmic adversary. In markets with specific broadcasting guidelines around religious content, the segment was reviewed carefully. The concern was about the soul being treated as a commodity that could be transacted for a pastry, and about the devil as an accessible commercial counterparty. Even in an obviously comedic frame, these depictions touched a content category that certain religious broadcasting standards found requiring review. The segment aired without edit in most markets, sometimes with scheduling adjustments. In several markets with specific religious broadcasting standards, the episode was cleared with the condition of a later time slot. Treehouse of Horror 13, from Season 14, aired in 2002, and demonstrates how the specific combination of content elements in a single episode can interact with multiple different regulatory frameworks across multiple markets. The episode contains 3 segments. Send in the Clones involves Homer acquiring a hammock that clones him, producing an expanding army of identical Homers. The government responds by eliminating the clone army. The ending of the segment involves the mass elimination of Homer copies, depicted in ways that are comedic but involve mass death even if the deaths are of clones. The island of Dr. Hibbert transposes the island of Dr. Moreau premise to Springfield, with Hibbert transforming Springfield's residents into human-animal hybrids. The transformation imagery is horror movie material applied to familiar characters. The fright to creep and scare harms involves zombies in the Old West. In Japan, the mass death imagery in the first segment and the transformation horror of the second placed the episode in a content classification that prevented broadcast during family hours. The episode aired in Japan in a significantly delayed time slot. In Germany, the mass death sequences in the first segment triggered the heightened regulatory sensitivity around violent death imagery that had affected other episodes. In Australia, the cumulative content across all 3 segments placed the episode in a classification bracket that prevented it from airing in its intended time slot. In each case, the specific element that triggered the concern was different. Japan focused on the mass death imagery. Germany focused on similar imagery through its own specific regulatory context. Australia applied a cumulative assessment. The outcome, a time slot adjustment, was similar across markets, but the reasoning behind it reflected different regulatory frameworks built around different cultural anxieties. There is a philosophical point underneath all of the Treehouse of Horror international difficulties. The Halloween context that makes the Treehouse of Horror episodes work in the United States is not merely decoration. It is part of the meaning. The darkness of the episodes is funny partly because of the time of year. It is darkness licensed by a cultural moment that says, "We are doing this together, as a community, And it is acceptable because we all understand what Halloween is and what it permits. When the episodes travel to markets where Halloween does not carry that weight, they arrive stripped of the context that made their darkness legible as humor, rather than simply as darkness. The content is the same. The context is absent. Without the context, the content reads differently. This is a problem that cannot be solved by editing the episodes. You cannot put the Halloween context into an episode broadcast in October in a country where October does not mean Halloween. The missing element is cultural rather than textual. What you can do is adjust the time slot so the content reaches an audience that is older and presumably more able to engage with horror content without the contextual frame. This is the solution most international broadcasters settled on, and it is probably the right solution within the constraints of what is possible. Section 12. The pattern behind the bans. We have spent a considerable amount of time in the specific details of specific episodes. The German edits, the Japanese broadcaster decision, the Brazilian diplomatic complaint, the affiliates who refused to show a gay character being treated as a good person, the BBC's scheduling concerns, the Chinese regulatory framework and its absolute prohibitions, the Treehouse of Horror timing adjustments, the post-September 11 pulls, the Michael Jackson self-censorship, the quiet invisible edits that happened before broadcast. Now let's step back and look at all of it together. Because when you lay all of these bans and restrictions side by side, a pattern emerges that says something beyond the specifics of any individual case. The first thing the pattern shows, censors almost universally react to the surface of content rather than to its meaning. The affiliates who refused to broadcast Homer's phobia were reacting to the presence of a gay character. They were not engaging with what the episode actually said about homosexuality, which was that fear of gay people is irrational and that gay people can be among the best people in your life. The episode was making an argument that the affiliates' stated values might have led them to support if they had engaged with it. Their refusal to broadcast prevented their audiences from receiving the argument. The Japanese broadcasters who declined to air 30 Minutes Over Tokyo were reacting to the depiction of the emperor in a way they read as disrespectful. The episode's underlying interest in Japanese culture was genuine. The satirical intent was not malicious. The broadcasters could not see past the images to the intent behind them. The Brazilian tourism ministry was reacting to the depiction of Rio as dangerous. The episode used that danger as comedic material. The ministry's formal complaint prevented engagement with the question of whether the episode's treatment was ultimately more honest than less honest about conditions that actually existed in the city. The Chinese regulators were responding to the presence of a reference to an event that the Chinese state had decided could not be referenced, regardless of context or tone. In almost every case, the censor responded to what the content looked like rather than what the content was saying. The satirical intent, the argument beneath the joke, the distinction between the image and the meaning it carried, these were invisible to the censors who objected. They saw the surface. The show was always working below it. The second thing the pattern shows, every ban is a form of disclosure. This is perhaps the most politically interesting dimension of looking at all these episodes together. Each country or organization or individual broadcaster that restricted a Simpsons episode was, in the act of restricting it, disclosing something about themselves, about what they were afraid of, about what they believed their audience could not handle, about what they considered too destabilizing to be seen. The affiliates who refused Homer's phobia disclosed their discomfort with gay representation being presented sympathetically. The Brazilian government disclosed the fragility of its international image and the extent to which it was monitoring foreign entertainment for content that might damage its tourism. The Japanese broadcasters disclosed the extraordinary cultural weight attached to the imperial institution. The German broadcasters disclosed the continuing resonance of regulatory frameworks designed to prevent the normalization of militarism. The BBC's medical advisors disclosed the public health concerns that shape British broadcasting around medical content. The Chinese regulators disclosed the absolute prohibition around the events of the 4th of June, 1989. None of these revelations were intended. The censors were trying to prevent something from being seen. But in the act of prevention, in the decision to restrict, they necessarily revealed the anxiety that drove the decision. The specific nature of each objection illuminates the specific nature of each censor's concern. Every ban is a confession. And read together, all of these confessions form a picture of the anxieties that different kinds of power carry about this specific show. The third thing the pattern shows, The show's consistent themes are the things that consistent power finds consistently threatening. The Simpsons returns again and again to certain ideas. The gap between what institutions claim and what they do. The way power is maintained not by force but by the consent of people who have been kept too tired and distracted to resist it. The small, stubborn, perpetually disappointed persistence of decency in human beings who live inside systems that do not reward decency. The comic futility of trying to be better than the world you live in allows you to be. These themes are dangerous to every institutional censor that has ever engaged with the show, because they are dangerous to every institution. A show about the gap between what authority claims and what authority does is a show that any authority has reason to distrust. A show about the powerlessness of ordinary people against large impersonal forces is a show that large impersonal forces would prefer ordinary people not watch. The specific content of each banned episode varies enormously. The specific objection of each censor varies. But underneath all of it, present in every case, there is the same anxiety in a slightly different form. This show is saying something about us that we would prefer our audience not hear. The fourth thing the pattern shows is about the show itself. The Simpsons was made by people who believed that the standards of American primetime television required a kind of dishonesty, a managed unreality that depicted family life, institutions, and the experience of ordinary people in ways that were systematically more cheerful and more reassuring than the actual truth. And the people who made the show declined to practice that dishonesty, not because they were trying to be provocative, but because they were trying to be honest, and honesty, in the context of American primetime television in 1989, was genuinely transgressive. Every ban and restriction in the history of the show is, at some level, a reaction to that honesty. The show said something true. The truth was uncomfortable for some specific institutional power. The institutional power tried to prevent the truth from being seen. The show was not trying to be dangerous, it was trying to be honest. And honesty in almost every media context in almost every country carries some degree of danger. The fifth thing the pattern shows is about the audience. Every episode that was banned was eventually seen by the people it was banned from. The affiliates who refused to air Homer's Phobia in 1997 were operating in a world where VHS tapes were already circulating nationally. The act of banning something from broadcast was already insufficient to prevent access to it. The episode was watched in the South and the rural Midwest on tapes made on the coasts, on signals received from distant markets, on recordings that friends and relatives sent through the mail. 30 Minutes Over Tokyo was watched in Japan through fan subs and pirated recordings almost immediately after its American broadcast. The non-broadcast on Japanese television did not meaningfully restrict Japanese viewers' access to the content. The City of New York versus Homer Simpson was watched continuously during its 5-year absence from American syndication, through home recordings and then through DVD releases and ultimately through streaming. Stark Raving Dad was on VHS tapes and DVD sets that were not recalled. The pull from streaming did not empty the collections that already contained it. The history of Simpsons censorship is, in large part, a history of censorship failing. Not always immediately, but eventually, and in ways the original decisions had no mechanism to prevent. The gatekeeping function of broadcast television was always more porous than it appeared, and the progression of distribution technology across the show's lifespan has made every historical ban increasingly theoretical. The censors lost. This is not a triumphalist statement. Some of what they were worried about was genuinely concerning. Some of the cultural anxieties behind the bans were legitimate cultural anxieties that reasonable people held in good faith. But all of the censors, acting in the terms of their own concerns, tried to prevent people from seeing something, and the people saw it anyway. Because the show was better at distributing itself than the censors were at restricting it. Because the audience wanted what the censors did not want them to have. And because audiences, over a sufficiently long timeline, tend to get what they want. Let's close here, in the quiet of whatever hour it is where you are. All of the noise, the protests, the congressional hearings, the affiliate decisions, the diplomatic complaints, the broadcaster reviews, the standards and practices negotiations, the self-censorship, the invisible edits, all of it fades eventually into the background of an evening in Springfield. The power plant hums somewhere in the distance. The reactor glows through the trees. Homer is already asleep on the couch, the television still on, the blue light of the screen washing over his face. Marge has turned off the lights upstairs. Bart is somewhere in his room, probably not sleeping, probably thinking about something that will cause trouble tomorrow. Lisa is reading. Maggie is watching the ceiling with those enormous eyes, thinking thoughts that nobody has ever heard her say out loud. The town is quiet. Somewhere outside, past the end of Evergreen Terrace, the world is still having arguments about what it is and is not allowed to see. Still drawing lines, still writing memos, still convening review panels to determine whether the cartoon is safe for the time slot, whether the cartoon is appropriate for the national broadcaster, whether the cartoon might affect the tourism industry, whether the cartoon might make children ask uncomfortable questions about prayer or souls or the emperor or who shot the billionaire. And the cartoon just keeps running. It runs past every attempt to stop it. It runs through the VHS era and the cable era and the streaming era and the era after whatever streaming becomes. It runs the way things run when they have found something true to say and enough people who want to hear it said. Eventually, you stop fighting that. Eventually, you settle into a comfortable position and let the thing wash over you, which is, as it happens, exactly what we have been doing tonight. The screen is still on. The show is still running. Somewhere in Springfield, the family is doing whatever they do when nobody is watching. The town that does not appear on any map is exactly where you left it. Right here. Waiting. Good night. End of script. Appendix episode reference list. Self-removed by creators. Stark Raving Dad, S3E1. Voluntarily removed 2019 following documentary, Leaving Neverland. Currently unavailable through official channels. Pulled for external events? The City of New York vs. Homer Simpson, S9E1. Pulled from U.S. syndication following the 11th of September 2001. Returned to rotation approximately 2006. New Kids on the Block, S12E14. Pulled from U.S. syndication following the 11th of September 2001. Returned to rotation faster than the New York episode. U.S. affiliate refusals. Homer's Phobia, S8E15. Multiple Southern and Midwestern U.S. affiliates refused broadcast. Won Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program. Aired widely elsewhere and received significant media coverage. Never broadcast in specific markets, broadcast television. 30 Minutes Over Tokyo, S10E23. Declined by major Japanese broadcast networks including NHK. Never lifted for Japanese broadcast television. Available through streaming. Goo Goo Gai Pan, S17E15. Removed from Chinese streaming distribution. Tiananmen Square reference cited as regulatory basis. Subject to formal governmental response. Blame it on Lisa, S13E15. Formal diplomatic complaint from Brazilian government and tourism ministry. Legal action threatened but never filed. Episode continued to air globally. Parliamentary and congressional reference. Itchy and Scratchy and Marge, S2E9, cited in U.S. congressional hearings on television, Violence 1990. Contributed to development of V-chip legislation and content rating system. Delayed for UK broadcast. Homer's Triple Bypass, S4E11. Delayed for BBC broadcast following medical advisory concerns about effect on cardiac patients' treatment-seeking behavior. Subject to organized religious campaign, no broadcast action. Homer the Heretic, S4E3. Southern Baptist Convention formal complaint to Fox. Aired without edit in all markets. Bart Sells His Soul, S7E4. Several U.S. affiliates adjusted scheduling. Aired in full in most markets. Cited positively in religious academic publications. Edited for German broadcast. Bart the General, S1E5. Sequences involving children and organized violence shortened by German broadcaster. Production edits before broadcast, invisible to viewers. Blood Feud, S2E22. Medication reference removed by legal review. Selma's Choice, S4E13. Food poisoning sequences modified by standards and practices. Homer Goes to College, S5E3. Injury scenes softened by standards and practices. International animation edits. Multiple early episodes. Four-fingered hands reanimated for initial Japanese broadcast due to Burakumin cultural sensitivity. Practice discontinued as the show became established. Scheduled in later time slots, multiple international markets. Homer's Barbershop Quartet, S5E1. Substance use humor classified for adult hours in Australia. Multiple Treehouse of Horror episodes. Multiple seasons. variously rescheduled in UK, Germany, Japan, and Australia due to horror content and the absence of Halloween cultural context in those markets. Gulf State broadcast adjustments. Homer vs. Patty and Selma, S6E17, ballet subplot, subject to scheduling adjustments in certain Gulf State broadcasting markets. Brazilian broadcast delay. Bart gets an F, S2E1. Delayed in Brazil following regulatory review of prayer scene. Eventually cleared and broadcast. Chinese distribution caution. The Principal and the Pauper, S9E2. Identified as a concern during broader Chinese distribution review negotiations. Arrangement with Chinese platforms did not fully materialize. Expansion D. What was lost, what was saved, and what the night sounds like in Springfield. There is a particular quality to late-night television watching that is different from any other kind of watching. You are tired. The day has released you. The obligations that structure waking hours have dissolved. The room is quiet, or if not quiet, then settled into whatever background texture your particular evening has produced. A fan. Traffic somewhere outside. The domestic sounds of the building around you. All of it familiar. All of it distant enough to feel like insulation rather than intrusion. And on the screen, Springfield. There is something specifically appropriate about watching The Simpsons late at night. The show was always partly a document of what the interior of an American home looks like. After dark, the television on, the family dispersed to their separate exhaustions, Homer fallen asleep, the blue light of the screen reflecting off faces that are no longer quite watching. The show depicted exactly the domestic situation in which millions of people were watching it. This is not a small thing. The experience of watching the show was mirrored inside the show itself. The Simpsons watch television. You watch The Simpsons. The recursion was built in from the beginning, so thoroughly that it became invisible. Of course, they watch television. Of course, Homer falls asleep on the couch. Of course, the glow of the screen is the ambient light of the living room. That is what living rooms look like. And the episodes that got banned, the ones we have spent this entire night sitting with, they mostly aired at night too. In the time slots that corresponded to the hours after children had been put to bed and adults had settled into the quiet portion of the evening. The hours when the day's requirements had finished and the television came on, and something could be watched with more relaxed attention than the pressured attention of earlier parts of the day. The censors were trying to manage what could enter those hours. They were trying to curate what arrived in those time slots, to filter what was appropriate from what was not, to protect viewers from content the gatekeepers had determined required protection. And the viewers watched anyway, rearranging their viewing, finding the episodes through other channels, sharing recordings, eventually streaming what the broadcast gatekeepers had tried to prevent them from seeing. This is the long arc of the story. The gate tries to hold. The water finds another way. The show that could not be stopped keeps running. Let's spend some time with specific episodes that are worth deeper attention than we have given them. Episodes whose relationship to restriction and cultural discomfort is more textured than a simple ban or complaint. Selma's Choice from Season 4 contains within it one of the show's most direct engagements with the economics of reproduction and the cost of choices made or not made in time. Selma is Marge's sister. She is not the warmest character in the show's world. She is somewhat harsh, somewhat judgmental, somewhat envious of what Marge has and she does not. But Selma's Choice treats her with complete seriousness. The episode comes at Selma's biological clock not as a joke but as an actual subject. She is aging. She is without a partner. The children she might have had are increasingly in the past rather than the future. The episode does not flinch from this. It does not make Selma's desire for children something to be satirized or gently laughed at. It takes the desire seriously and the diminishing time to fulfill it seriously. Selma ultimately decides to try to adopt. The episode ends before the process is complete, and subsequent seasons would continue her story in various ways. But the emotional register of this episode, the sustained seriousness with which it treats a middle-aged single woman's relationship to the choice of parenthood, was unusual for the show and unusual for primetime television in the early 1990s. The food poisoning subplot involving Homer served multiple functions. It provided the episode with its comedy quota. It gave Homer something to do while Selma's story occupied the emotional center. And it allowed the show to approach Selma's story without the tonal mismatch that would have resulted from attempting a fully serious, dramatic episode of The Simpsons. A tonal register the show has never been built for and has never pretended to be. The balancing act is characteristic. The show almost always approached its most serious material with a comedy element running simultaneously, not because the serious material was embarrassing or needed to be softened, but because the simultaneous operation of both registers was the show's specific way of being honest. Life is simultaneously serious and funny. The show's form reflected that. A subplot about Homer getting food poisoning from a dumpster sandwich, and a story about a woman confronting her own mortality around the question of motherhood, these were not incompatible. They were the same show, because the same world contains both of them. And Maggie Makes 3 from Season 6 is one of the most beloved episodes the show produced, and one that almost never appears in discussions of the show's relationship to restriction or controversy, because it navigated the cultural moment it arrived in with a precision that prevented controversy rather than inviting it. The episode is told in flashback. Homer explains to Bart and Lisa why there are no photographs of Maggie in the family photo albums. The story it tells involves Homer quitting his job at the nuclear plant, the job he hated, the job that represented everything that was wrong with his life, to follow his dream of working at a bowling alley. The bowling alley is everything the power plant is not. Homer is happy there. He is relaxed. He has found the thing he was always meant to do. And then Marge gets pregnant with Maggie. Homer cannot support a family of 5 on a bowling alley salary. He has to go back to Burns, hat in hand, asking for his old job back. Burns gives it to him, but arranges for the space above Homer's workstation to display a demotivational plaque. Don't forget, you're here forever. The episode's ending is one of the most precisely constructed emotional gestures in the show's history. Homer explains to Bart and Lisa why there are no photographs of Maggie in the albums. He has put all the photographs of Maggie in a different place, at his workstation, covering the demotivational plaque in a specific arrangement that transforms it to read, "Do it for her." The episode makes you feel something. It makes you feel something real and specific about love and sacrifice, and the way the weight of caring for people can be simultaneously the heaviest thing and the thing that makes everything bearable. Homer is trapped in a job he hates. He has arranged his prison to remind him why the prison is worth enduring. No censor, no broadcaster, no pressure group ever raised a concern about this episode. There was nothing to raise a concern about. The episode was beyond the categories of concern that censors operate with. It was not violent or sexual or religiously offensive or politically contentious. It was simply true about something that millions of people in the audience recognized from their own lives. The show did not require controversy to produce its best work, but its best work often required navigating institutional pressures that, when the show got it right, became invisible. The absence of controversy around And Maggie Makes 3 is the measure of how well the show threaded the needle, how successfully it said a genuinely moving thing about family and sacrifice without triggering any of the reflexive resistance that had attached to so many other episodes. Homer Badman from Season 6 is the episode that most directly addresses the show's relationship to media representation and the dynamics of public accusation and denial. Homer is accused of sexual harassment. A graduate student who babysat for the family claims Homer grabbed her inappropriately. Homer's explanation that he grabbed her because he saw a rare gummy Venus de Milo candy stuck to her clothing and he wanted it is true and absurd and completely unbelievable to anyone hearing it without context. The episode follows Homer's attempt to defend himself against an accusation that is false, using the truth that sounds like a lie. It depicts the way media narratives operate, how a story, once it has achieved the shape of a compelling narrative, becomes resistant to complicating evidence. The reporter who has a story about a harasser has no interest in a story about a man who grabs someone's clothing to get a piece of candy. The first story is a story. The second story is just confusion. The episode is, simultaneously, a meditation on the dynamics of sexual harassment accusations and a comedy about Homer's specific relationship to food-based decision-making. It manages to hold both of these registers at once without pretending they are not in tension. Fox Standards and Practices conducted an extended review of the episode before broadcast. The concern was about the accusation itself, about whether an animated comedy was an appropriate venue for a plot involving sexual harassment, whether the episode's treatment of the accusation was appropriate given the sensitivity of the subject, and specifically whether the episode's ultimate resolution, Homer is vindicated through a convenient recording, gave the wrong impression about how real sexual harassment cases are typically resolved. The creative team made the case that the episode was not primarily about sexual harassment as a social phenomenon, but about the dynamics of media representation and public accusation about what happens when the structure of a narrative becomes more powerful than the evidence it is supposed to be. Based on, they argued that this was a subject the show was well equipped to address and that the comedic register was appropriate because it allowed the show to illuminate something true without requiring the gravity of a drama. The episode aired without modification following the review. It became one of the episodes from that era most often discussed by media critics as an example of the show's sophistication about how media operates. Bart's Dog Gets an F from Season 2 is an episode that gets less attention than it deserves in discussions of what the show was doing in its early period. The episode involves Santa's Little Helper, the Simpson family's greyhound. The dog is destroying things. It has chewed furniture, stolen food, caused chaos. The family reaches the conclusion that if the dog cannot be trained, it must be given away. Bart is responsible for training the dog. He takes it to an obedience school run by Emily Winthrop, who becomes one of the show's most sharply observed minor characters. She is strict, demanding, and completely uninterested in Bart's attempts to charm or evade his way through the program. She requires actual work. She will accept no substitutes. The episode's subject is responsibility. Real responsibility, the kind that requires sustained effort over time, that does not accommodate shortcuts, that produces results only when approached with genuine commitment. Bart is being asked to do something genuinely difficult for him, to care about something other than his immediate desires, and to work for something he values. The episode treats this as genuinely hard. It does not simplify the difficulty. Bart struggles. He fails, repeatedly. The dog continues to misbehave despite his attempts. The failure is real, and its consequences are real. If he does not succeed, he loses the dog. And then he succeeds, not through a shortcut or a trick or a convenient coincidence, through actually doing the thing in the specific and sustained way that doing things actually requires. The scene where Santa's Little Helper obeys Bart's commands for the first time, the moment where the training has worked, where the effort has produced the result, where Bart has done the hard thing and the hard thing has paid off, is one of the early season's most genuinely satisfying moments. It is satisfying because it was earned. The episode made you feel the difficulty. The success means something because the failure was real. No one banned this episode. No one restricted it. It aired everywhere and generated no controversy. But it is an example of what the show was quietly doing in its early period that had nothing to do with pushing limits. It was just telling a true story about what it costs to be responsible for something you love. Flanders Ladder from Season 29 represents the show's most recent engagement with the kind of structural ambiguity that had characterized its best middle-period episodes. The episode involves Homer being struck by lightning and lying in a coma. Homer in a coma, the premise that has haunted the show's entire fan discourse since 1993, and experiencing visions. The visions involve deceased characters from the show's history. It is, in many ways, a meditation on the show's relationship to its own past. The episode aired at a time when the conversation about the show's legacy, about what it meant for a show to have run for 3 decades, had become part of the cultural context in which new episodes were received. Watching a 2018 Simpsons episode is not the same as watching a 1993 Simpsons episode, because the 2018 episode arrives encrusted with 30 years of accumulated meaning. Flanders Ladder engages with this directly. The coma premise, the deceased characters, the tone of retrospection, these are all elements that acknowledge what the show has become over time. The episode is partly about Homer's relationship to death, and partly about the show's relationship to its own death, to the inevitable end that it has been deferring for 30 years, and will presumably defer for as long as there is an audience willing to watch and a network willing to fund it. The episode was not controversial, but it is part of the ongoing story of what the show is, and what it is becoming the story of a show that has outlasted every attempt to define it, that has survived every controversy and every restriction and every claim that it had lost what made it worth watching, and that continues to produce episodes that, at their best, are still doing something worth watching. There are episodes we have not discussed that deserve at least a passing acknowledgement. The Bob Next Door from Season 21 involves a face transplant that reveals Sideshow Bob in disguise. The episode contains depictions of facial reconstruction surgery that the show's medical content reviewers assessed carefully before the network broadcast cleared it. Several markets with specific broadcast standards around medical imagery scheduled the episode for later slots. Wedding for Disaster from Season 20 involves Homer and Marge's marriage being retroactively voided due to a technical licensing issue. The episode's treatment of legal marriage, specifically the question of what constitutes a valid marriage and what happens when validity is retroactively questioned, generated review in several markets with specific broadcasting standards around depictions of marriage institutions. The episode aired without modification in most markets. Marge in Chains from Season 4. The episode that contains the influenza spreading from Japan plotline that would be recalled during the COVID-19 pandemic was reviewed by medical content advisors before its original broadcast in 1993. The depiction of a viral outbreak spreading through the community was assessed for whether the comedic treatment was appropriate given real public health considerations. The episode aired without modification. 27 years later, it became one of the show's most cited examples of apparent prediction. Homer's Night Out from Season 1 contains an early example of the show's treatment of gender and objectification that was ahead of its time in several ways. The episode involves Homer being photographed at a party with a dancing woman and the photograph circulating without his consent. The episode takes seriously the harm of being objectified and circulated, applies the harm to Homer in a way that illuminates what that harm involves when applied to women without making this the explicit subject of the episode. Standards and Practices reviewed the episode but cleared it without modification. It aired without incident. Let me spend a little more time with Stark Raving Dad because it deserves it. We discussed earlier the broad contours of the episode, the production history, Michael Jackson's involvement, the self-censorship decision made by the show's production company in 2019, following the release of Leaving Neverland. But there is more to say about the episode itself, about what it was doing before it became what it became. The episode aired in September 1991 as the Season 3 premiere. It had been a summer-long mystery. The Simpsons staff had recorded an episode featuring a guest voice that they refused to confirm or identify. Reports circulated, were denied, were partly confirmed. By the time the episode aired, the speculation had generated the kind of anticipatory energy that only a mystery can produce. The episode opens with Homer being sent to a mental institution by Mr. Burns, who is alarmed by Homer arriving at work wearing a pink shirt. At the institution, Homer meets Leon Kompowski, a large man from New Jersey who believes he is Michael Jackson. The voice of this character, large, gentle, confident, expressing himself in the characteristic cadences of Michael Jackson, is heard before it is attributed. You know who you are hearing. The show's long denial of the guest voice made the recognition feel like a reveal. What happens in the episode after the setup is more interesting than the setup. Homer befriends Leon. Leon helps Homer understand that he has failed to properly acknowledge his daughter's birthday. Lisa has turned 8. Homer has forgotten. The episode builds toward a resolution in which Leon, the possibly delusional man who believes he is Michael Jackson, helps Bart write a birthday song for Lisa. The song is performed. It is genuinely sweet. It is a real song, not a parody. It is a song that a brother wrote for his sister because a stranger helped him see that his sister deserved acknowledgement. Leon, after the song, reveals that he is in fact Leon Kompowski, a bricklayer from New Jersey. The Michael Jackson persona was something he used because it made people treat him differently, made them listen to him. He is, in some sense, the healthiest person in the episode. He knew exactly what he was doing and why, and when he was done, he put the persona aside. This is a remarkably compassionate reading of the relationship between performance and identity. The man who believes he is Michael Jackson is not delusional. He is tactical. He has discovered that performing Michael Jackson makes the world treat him like someone worth listening to. When he finds someone who listens to him as himself, Homer, who does not care who Leon is because Homer is not particularly good at caring about identity, he does not need the performance anymore. The episode was, in its time, one of the warmest and most emotionally satisfying of the early seasons. Yeardley Smith's performance at the birthday scene, Lisa receiving a song that her brother wrote because a stranger helped him see that she mattered, is one of the early show's most genuinely touching moments. All of this exists in the episode that is no longer officially available. The warmth of the birthday scene, the compassionate reading of Leon Kompowski, the genuinely good song, all of it is embedded in the episode that was pulled from official streaming platforms in 2019. Whether the decision to pull the episode was correct is a question that reasonable people continue to disagree about. The questions it raises about how art should respond to new information about the people who contributed to it are genuine and do not have simple answers. But the episode that was pulled was a genuinely good episode. It was not a good episode that happened to have Michael Jackson in it. The Michael Jackson element was essential to what the episode was doing, the specific quality of the voice, the specific cultural resonance of the persona, the gap between the figure and the bricklayer. All of it contributed to the emotional effect the episode achieved. When the episode was pulled, what was lost was not just Michael Jackson's voice. What was lost was the specific achievement of an episode that used a very specific set of cultural materials to say something specific about friendship and family and the relationship between who we perform and who we are. The night is getting later. You can feel it in the quality of the quiet. The sounds that were background earlier have thinned to something more minimal. The world has settled further into itself. The hour that exists on the other side of most people's bedtime, when the traffic has finally gone and even the determined night sounds have found their rhythm and there is nothing left but the low ambient hum of a world that is briefly, partially, incompletely at rest. In Springfield, this is Homer's hour. Homer falls asleep in front of the television at a time that suggests he does not actually watch most of the things he intends to watch. He starts watching. He intends to watch the whole thing. The sofa absorbs him. The cushion receives him. The programming continues above his closed eyes. And Springfield goes on around his sleeping body. Marge turns off the kitchen light. The house gets quieter. Bart is in his room, probably awake, probably not doing anything he should be doing. Lisa has her bedside light on, reading something that is either going to deepen her already inconvenient intellectual curiosity or confirm a sadness she has been carrying since an episode several seasons ago. Maggie is awake in her crib, watching the ceiling with complete attention, thinking whatever Maggie thinks about in the hours before dawn. The television is still on in the living room. Homer is asleep. The show keeps running. This is the thing about banned episodes that never quite get said simply enough. They are still in people. The episodes that were pulled from streaming are on hard drives and in memory. The episodes that affiliates refused to air were watched on tape and then on disc, and then through the infinite informal distribution networks of the internet. The episodes that were edited were seen in their edited form and then, later, in their original form, which you can find if you know where to look. The episodes that were restricted in Japan were watched in Japan through channels the restriction did not reach. The episodes that were delayed in the UK were watched through Sky and satellite, and eventually through streaming. The episodes that the Chinese regulators excluded from official distribution were watched in China through the mechanisms that always carry prohibited things into places they are officially not permitted to go. The content existed. The content persists. The restriction did not destroy the thing it was trying to manage. It only shaped the experience of encountering it, gave it, in many cases, the additional quality of being something that had been fought over, that carried behind it the record of the fight. The fight is part of the thing now. The story of Homer's phobia includes the story of the affiliates who would not show it. The story of Stark Raving Dad includes the story of 2019 and the decision to pull it. The story of the city of New York versus Homer Simpson includes the 5 years when the most explicit imagery was kept off American screens, and the episode acquired the particular status of something associated with mourning and restriction and careful navigation of a cultural wound. These stories are not the episodes, but they surround the episodes. They are the context in which the episodes exist now, and the context shapes how the episodes are seen. You cannot unwatch Homer's phobia knowing that some people tried to prevent you from watching it. The knowledge is part of the experience. It sharpens the episode. It makes you more aware of what it is doing. It gives you, as a viewer, a reason to attend more carefully to what the affiliates found threatening to watch for it, to find it, to recognize it when it arrives. The censors made the episodes more worth watching. This is the deepest irony of the entire subject. There are children who grew up with The Simpsons who are now the age of Homer and Marge when the show began. This is a genuinely disorienting fact that arrives differently depending on when you encountered the show. If you were 10 in 1990, you are 45 now. Homer is still 36. Marge is still younger than you are. Bart is still younger than your children will be when you have them. The show has outlasted the generational relationship that originally defined it. The parents who let their children watch it, or prohibited their children from watching it, are now grandparents. The congressional hearings that addressed it were held by politicians who are retired or dead. The pressure groups that organize campaigns against it are running different campaigns about different shows. The affiliates that refused specific episodes have been absorbed into media consolidation that has largely replaced the affiliate network relationship with something more centralized. And the show is still on. Not because it is still what it was. It is not what it was. The show that exists now is a different show from the show that generated all of the controversies we have spent this night with, in the sense that the team that made the things worth fighting over has largely dispersed, and the things that remain are the products of a different creative configuration. The Simpsons exists now as an institution, rather than as a creative project in the way it was in its peak years. But it is still on, and occasionally, in an episode among the hundreds, there is a moment that has the quality of the old moments, a moment where the observation is precise and the feeling is real, and the show says something that matters more than it needed to. These moments are rarer now than they were, but they still happen. And they happen in a show that has survived every attempt to stop it, limit it, edit it, relocate it, ban it, pull it, or prevent people from seeing it. That is not nothing, that is in fact quite a lot. If you have been listening to this through the night, you are probably at the edge of sleep now. The voice has been going a long time. The content has been moving slowly through the specific history of a show and all the ways that history has been shaped by the friction between what the show wanted to say and what various institutional powers preferred it not say. All of that friction, that history, that accumulation of objections and restrictions and bans and diplomatic complaints and affiliate decisions and invisible edits, it has settled into the background now. It is context rather than subject. The specific details have blurred slightly into the general texture of a night spent in the vicinity of Springfield. What remains is something simpler. A show. An unlikely show. A show that was never supposed to last, that was never supposed to matter the way it mattered, that was supposed to be a novelty, and became instead the longest-running American primetime scripted television series in the history of the medium. A show that made people laugh for 36 years. A show that made people feel things they had not expected to feel from a cartoon. A show that said things that needed to be said and said them in ways that reached people who might not have been reached by the same things said differently. A show that various institutions spent various amounts of energy trying to restrict and could not restrict, because the show was too good at being what it was, and the audience was too determined to find it. The screen is still on. Homer is still on the couch. The light is blue and steady, and somewhere outside the house on Evergreen Terrace, the town is quiet in the way it gets quiet at the end of a long night, which is not silent but closer to silence than it gets at any other hour. In the morning, Homer will wake up and stumble to the kitchen. Marge will be there. The coffee will exist in the way that coffee reliably exists in that house. The kitchen will be the kitchen. The family will converge in the way that the family reliably converges in the morning before dispersing again to the separate requirements of their separate days. Bart will make something explode eventually. Lisa will be disappointed about something that deserves to be disappointing. Maggie will observe everything from a position of complete and deliberate calm. Burns will scheme from the heights of his extraordinary accumulated wealth and power. Ned will be kind in the specific, constrained way that Ned is kind. Moe will be sad. Chief Wiggum will fail to prevent or solve something. Krusty will perform a diminished version of what he once was. Dr. Nick will practice medicine with specific incompetence. Springfield will be Springfield, and you will watch it, or you will remember watching it, or you will fall asleep to the sound of it and wake up and it will still be on. Because that is what Springfield does. It stays. Against everything, against every attempt to move it, change it, ban it, restrict it, edit it, pull it, contain it, prevent it from being seen, it stays. And in staying, it keeps saying the things it has always been saying, in the voice it has always used, to the audience it has always had. You are still here. The show is still here. The night is almost done. Good night, Springfield. This script was written for sleep and relaxation narration purposes. All episode information is based on publicly available broadcast history, production commentary, academic analysis, and documented controversies. The Simpsons remains the longest-running American animated series, the longest-running American primetime scripted series, and one of the most extensively analyzed television programs in the history of the medium. 788 episodes and counting. Expansion E, the long middle hours. There is a specific texture to the middle hours of a sleep video that is different from either the opening or the closing. The opening carries the energy of beginning the slight lift of a new subject, a voice you are still calibrating to, the interest of not quite knowing yet where the night is going to take you. The closing carries the quality of ending the deliberate slowing. The sentences that get longer and slightly more spacious, the sense of a destination being approached, but the middle hours have a quality that belongs entirely to themselves. The beginning has passed, the ending has not yet arrived. You are somewhere in the sustained center of the thing, and the sustained center of a long night of listening is where real rest lives. The voice has become familiar, the subject has become comfortable, your body has found its arrangement, the blanket has settled. The room is exactly as dark as it was an hour ago. The world outside is doing whatever it does in the early morning hours before it decides to become morning. This is the space. This is the space where we are going to spend some time. Not rushing toward the conclusion, not filling time, just being here in the middle of a long night's worth of stories about a cartoon and the world it lived in, and all the ways the world tried to tell it what it was allowed to say. There is a version of the history of The Simpsons that focuses entirely on the victories. The show that was too honest for primetime television in 1989 and changed what primetime television was allowed to be. The show that generated 30 years of controversy and kept running through all of it. The show that affiliates refused to broadcast and governments complained about and censors edited and pressure groups boycotted, and it outlasted every single one of them and is still on. That version of the history is true. Everything in it is accurate. The show did win. It won consistently and comprehensively against every institutional force that tried to contain it. But there is another version of the history, the version that notices what was lost, the version that looks at the invisible, edits the sequences that were shortened, the lines that were softened, the jokes that were made less precise in the process of being made acceptable, and acknowledges that these were losses, small losses in most cases, losses that did not prevent the show from being excellent, but losses nonetheless. The version that notices that Homer's phobia, not airing on certain affiliates, meant that people in certain markets, the people for whom the episode's argument was most relevant, the people most likely to know someone whose experience mirrored the anxieties the episode was addressing, did not see it in the form in which it was most likely to reach them. They could find it. They eventually could find it. But the specific access of broadcast television, the thing that is simply on, that arrives in your living room without your having to seek it, that access was denied. The version that takes seriously the weight of stark raving dad being unavailable, not because Michael Jackson's reputation should override the interests of the people his alleged actions harmed. It should not. But because the episode that was pulled was a genuinely good episode, and the song at the center of it was a genuinely sweet song, and the people who wrote it and performed it had made something real, and the decision to make it officially unavailable removed something from the accessible record of American television. The question of whether that removal was justified and the question of what was lost are separate questions. Both deserve to be asked. The version that notices that when The City of New York versus Homer Simpson was pulled from American syndication after the 11th of September, 2001. The decision was made by people who were navigating something enormous and painful and genuinely uncertain. The Twin Towers footage in the episode was not something they had made with the knowledge of what those towers would become. They had made it with the towers as background, as scenery, as a detail of the New York landscape that any depiction of New York would include. After September 11th, the scenery was something else entirely. The decision to pull the episode was not simple. It was a response to genuine grief and genuine confusion about what respect for that grief required. Both versions of the history are true. The show won, and things were lost. Let's talk about something that almost never gets discussed in the context of the show's controversies: the people who wrote the letters. When Homer the Heretic aired and the Southern Baptist Convention wrote to Fox, someone at the Southern Baptist Convention sat down and thought about what to say and wrote the letter. That person had watched the episode and felt that something important to them had been treated carelessly or disrespectfully, or with an easiness that seemed to them insufficient to the weight of what was being depicted. That feeling is real. The person who wrote the letter was expressing something genuine. They cared about something. The thing they cared about had been touched by a primetime cartoon in a way that felt wrong to them. And they did what seemed reasonable to do when something feels wrong. They wrote a letter. Most discussions of Simpsons controversies do not have much space for the people who wrote the letters. The narrative of the show's censorship history is a narrative in which the censors are antagonists and the show is the hero. This is a fair narrative as far as it goes. The show's honesty was more valuable than the censor's management of institutional anxiety. The episodes that were restricted were, in most cases, better for having been made than the alternative of their not having been made would have been. But the people who wrote the letters were not all simple antagonists. Some of them were people with genuine concerns that the show's excellence did not require dismissing. The Brazilian government's concern about international cultural power imbalance was a real concern about something real. The Japanese broadcaster's concern about the depiction of the imperial institution was a real concern about the specific cultural weight of that institution. The parents who worried about what their children were absorbing from cartoon violence were expressing a real concern about real children. The show's creative team engaged with some of these concerns more seriously than others. The medical advisors who flagged content around healthcare sought engagement with medical professionals. The religious groups who raised concerns about specific episodes received formal network responses. The concern that was never fully engaged with, across the show's entire history, was the concern about cultural power. The concern that a show made in America, by Americans, for an American audience, with American cultural assumptions built into every joke and every observation and every satirical frame that this show traveled the world, carrying those assumptions and applying them to cultures that had not been consulted about. The application? This is not a concern that requires the show to stop making jokes about other countries. It requires only a recognition that the jokes travel, that the cultural assumptions behind them travel with them, and that the people on the receiving end of those jokes are engaging with something that was made about them, but not with them. The best satire is made with knowledge and care. The Simpsons, at its best, was made with knowledge and care about American life, because the people who made it had lived American life. When it traveled abroad and attempted satire of other cultures, it was working with less intimate knowledge and therefore less reliable care. The Japan episode and the Brazil episode are not failures, because the show tried to do something they should not have tried. They are cautionary examples of what happens when the intimacy that makes great satire work is absent. The Two Mrs. Nahasapi Mapedalins from Season 8 is an episode about the Simpson family's neighbor, Apu, and his arranged marriage. It introduced the character of Manjula, who would become Apu's wife and a significant recurring character in subsequent seasons. The episode's treatment of the arranged marriage tradition is neither straightforwardly critical nor straightforwardly celebratory. It treats the tradition as something that comes from a place and has its own logic and produces outcomes that, in this specific case, lead to genuine mutual affection developing between people who began as strangers. It also treats the tradition as something that Apu has complicated feelings about, having spent years in America where the arranged marriage tradition is not the norm. The episode was produced without significant external controversy. It received some critical attention from South Asian commentators who noted that the depiction of Indian cultural practices was filtered through the specific limitations of an American writing staff, and that some of the comedy involving those practices was at the expense of the culture rather than in genuine dialogue with it. This is a variant of the same concern that arose with the Japan episode and the Brazil episode, applied to a recurring character rather than a travel episode. The difference is that Apu appeared in hundreds of episodes across the show's run, which meant that, however the character was written, had a cumulative effect that no single episode could capture. The larger debate about Apu as a character, a debate that intensified significantly in the late 2010s, following the documentary The Problem with Apu, is outside the direct scope of what we have been discussing tonight, but it connects to the same fundamental question. A show made by a specific cultural group with specific cultural assumptions represents, through its creative choices, a set of values and perspectives. When those choices involve representing other cultural groups, the question of whose values and perspectives are shaping the representation becomes important. The show's creative team made choices about Apu that seemed unremarkable within the cultural context of the show's production. Those choices looked different from outside that context, and looked different again as the cultural context changed over the 3 decades of the character's existence. This is the version of the show's relationship to restriction that does not involve any external censor or any governmental action or any affiliate refusal. The restriction, in this case, emerged from within the culture that had previously consumed the character without significant concern. The audience changed. The cultural context changed. The character that had existed for decades without generating significant controversy began to generate controversy. Not because the episodes had changed, because the lens through which they were seen had changed. The City of New York versus Homer Simpson deserves more time than we gave it earlier. The episode aired on September 21st, 1997, 4 years before the attacks that would define the city for the next generation and would make the episode's imagery impossible to watch in the way it had been watched when it first aired. The episode is about Homer's car being towed. He and his family go to New York to retrieve it from the base of the Twin Towers, where it has been left while Homer waited too long to get it out of a no-parking zone. The comedy of the episode comes from the specific character of New York City as it existed in the late 1990s. The pace, the aggression, the density, the way the city requires a kind of constant negotiation that Homer is specifically ill-equipped to engage in. The Twin Towers are background in the episode. They are where the car is. They are used as a landmark the way that New York landmarks are used in any depiction of New York. The comedy is not about the towers. The towers are simply there, as they were simply there for everyone in New York and everyone in the rest of the country who had a mental image of the New York skyline. When the towers fell on the 11th of September 2001, they took with them a version of the world in which the Twin Towers were simply background. They had always been simply background, for the 40 years they existed. They became the center of everything, the most present absence in the New York skyline and in the American cultural imagination, on the day they fell. The people who made the decision to pull The City of New York versus Homer Simpson from syndication were making a specific judgment about what that absence required. They were saying, the towers are too present in this episode, in the specific form of their most famous recent absence, for the episode to function as entertainment. For the episode to function as the comedy it was made to be. They were right about this in 2001. The wounds were too fresh. The episode that depicted the towers as simply there as backdrop, as landmark, as the kind of permanent feature of a skyline that you do not think about because it has always been. There was an episode that could not be watched in late 2001 without the absence being everywhere in it. The comedy required the towers to be what they were in 1997. The towers could not be what they were in 1997. The comedy, therefore, could not function. Over time, the wounds changed. Not healed, the word healed does not apply to something that large, but changed. The specific rawness of the earliest years gave way to something more like the presence of permanent grief, which is different from acute grief in the way that living with something differs from being shocked by it. The towers remained an absence. But the absence became familiar in the way that absences become familiar when enough time has passed. By 2006, when the episode returned to syndication, the cultural moment had shifted enough that the comedy could function alongside the grief rather than being destroyed by it. The episode could be watched again. It was not the same episode it had been in 1997. It was the same episode it had been in 1997, seen through the specific lens that September 11th had ground into everyone who had lived through it. The 5 years of its absence were not a mistake. They were the correct response to a specific cultural moment. The return was also the correct response to the moment when the culture had moved far enough that the return was possible. The Treehouse of Horror episodes deserve one more visit before we let them rest. Every year, the show produces an anthology episode that plays with its own horror relationship. Every year, something in the anthology generates some degree of concern from some quarter of the broadcasting world. And every year, the episode airs, usually with some scheduling adjustments in some markets, and the audience watches it with the expectation of being mildly frightened in the Halloween spirit. What is interesting about the consistency of this pattern is what it reveals about the relationship between horror, comedy, and cultural context. Horror is the genre that most explicitly requires a frame. You cannot experience horror as horror without some agreement between the work and the audience about what kind of experience is being offered. The horror film requires you to understand that you are watching a horror film. The haunted house requires you to understand that the scares are invited. The Treehouse of Horror episodes require you to understand that the darkness is Halloween darkness licensed, recreational, communal. When those episodes travel to markets where Halloween does not provide that frame, they arrive without the license. The darkness is the same. The content is identical. But the context in which the content appears has changed, and the context is doing an enormous amount of the work. Without it, the darkness is just dark. This is one of the most interesting things that international broadcast teaches you about the relationship between content and context. The content does not carry its meaning with it. The meaning is produced in the encounter between the content and the context in which it is received. Change the context and the meaning changes. The episode has not changed. What the episode is has changed. The censors who responded to Treehouse of Horror episodes in non-Halloween cultural contexts were responding to something real. The episodes were different in their context than in their intended context. The scheduling adjustments were an attempt to put the episodes in a context adult viewing hours, audiences with more resources to engage with horror content without the protective frame of Halloween that was somewhat closer to the frame in which they were designed to function. This is not a perfect solution. The adult viewing hour is not Halloween. Nothing about late-night television in a country without Halloween is going to approximate the specific cultural permission structure that Halloween provides. But it is the best adjustment available within the constraints of what broadcast can offer, and it is a more thoughtful response than either ignoring the context problem or refusing to broadcast the episodes at all. Let's stay in the slow hour for a little while longer. The specific episodes and controversies are behind us now. We have been through them in enough detail that they have become familiar, which is what detailed knowledge does to things. It does not diminish them, but it makes them part of the furniture of the mind, rather than things that are still surprising. They are there. They are known. You can return to any of them if you want to. They will be where you left them. What remains is a quieter thing. The sense of what the show was, what it tried to do, why the things it tried to do generated the resistance they generated, and what the resistance reveals about the world the show was operating in. The world the show was operating in was, and remains, a world that is more comfortable with certain kinds of honesty than with others. Physical comedy, generally permitted. Emotional truth about family life, permitted in controlled doses. Satire of institutional authority, permitted if not too specific. Direct challenge to the assumptions on which the existing order rests, requires careful navigation. The Simpsons spent 36 years navigating. Sometimes it got through. Sometimes it was stopped at the gate. Sometimes the gate that stopped it was external, an affiliate, a broadcaster, a government, a pressure group. Sometimes the gate was internal standards and practices, legal review, the actor's own sense of what a character would and would not say. All of those gates shaped the show. The show that exists is partly defined by the gates it passed through and partly defined by the places where it had to find another way. The censored episodes are part of the show. The invisible edits are part of the show. The 5 years of syndication absence is part of the show. The affiliate refusals are part of the show. The show is not just the episodes as they aired. The show is the episodes as they aired, plus all the history of how they came to air in the form in which they aired, through the process that shaped them, against the resistance that tried to prevent them. All of that is The Simpsons. Homer is still asleep on the couch. The television is still on. Somewhere in the house, something is quiet that might not have been quiet earlier, the particular quality of quiet that settles in when the members of a family have finally all achieved sleep. Marge breathes slowly in the bedroom. Her hair is down. The remarkable hair that defies physics and gravity and every ordinary force that acts on ordinary things, it is down and spread across the pillow in a way that is simply hair, ordinary and soft and human. Bart is somewhere between sleep and whatever runs through his mind in the territory between sleep and waking, the place where mischief and something more honest than mischief commingle, where the boy who causes trouble and the boy who is occasionally capable of something like grace exist alongside each other in the specific peace that only the body's insistence on rest can produce. Lisa is asleep with her saxophone somewhere within reach, because that is where Lisa keeps it, because music is what she has, because in a world that does not quite accommodate her, there is always music as the thing that doesn't require the world's accommodation. Maggie watches the ceiling. You know by now what Maggie thinks about while watching the ceiling. You know what she is planning and why she is waiting and what the silence contains. Or you know as much as the show has ever let anyone know, which is enough to suspect and not quite enough to be sure. The town outside is doing what it does in the last hours before morning. The power plant hums. The cooling towers breathe their improbable breath into the Springfield sky. Burns is alive somewhere in his castle, maintained and managed and kept running through the schedule that Smithers maintains, because Smithers knows what happens if the schedule slips. Ned is asleep, dreaming clean dreams in the specific dream space of a man whose aggressive unconscious has been so thoroughly conditioned that even his dreams observe the behavior protocols. Mo is awake at the bar after closing, because Mo is often awake at the bar after closing. And in all the years that the show has been running, in all the episodes that aired and all the episodes that were pulled and all the episodes that were edited and delayed and scheduled in different time slots in different countries for different reasons, through all of that, Springfield has been here. The same town in the same impossible geography, occupied by the same people in their permanent present tense, doing the same things they have always done. The show will still be on tomorrow, and the night after that, and the night after that, for as long as there are people who want to spend a night in Springfield, which, if 36 years is any indication, is going to be for a very long time. Sleep. The voice is going quiet now. The stories have been told. The controversies have been laid out and examined and set down again. The affiliates and the governments and the pressure groups and the standards and practices departments and the diplomatic complaints, all of it has settled into the background where history settles when you have been with it long enough that it is no longer news and has become simply the texture of what was. The show ran. It is still running. The things that tried to stop it did not stop it. And in the end, that is the whole story. Everything else, all the detail, all the specificity, all the individual episodes and individual controversies and individual decisions made by individual people in individual rooms, all of that was the story of how the show got from 1,989 to now without stopping. The texture of a long survival. Springfield is still there. You can go back whenever you want. The couch will be the same. The family will be the same. The television will be on. Homer will be asleep or about to be asleep. And whatever episode is running will be one of the 788 episodes. And it will be doing what the show does, which is seeing clearly and saying honestly what it sees. In the specific voice it developed over 3 decades of navigating the world's preference for comfortable dishonesty. That voice is still there. Good night. A note on watching. There is something that the people who study sleep and the people who study memory have found independently and through different methods that arrived at the same place. The brain, in the hours before deep sleep, is unusually receptive to narrative. The stories you encounter in the slow dissolution between waking and sleeping occupy the mind differently from the stories you encounter in full alert consciousness. They settle. They sink. They become part of the texture of what you know, without the hard edges that waking attention imposes on new information. This is why certain kinds of content are better than others for the specific purpose of falling asleep to. Not silence. Silence can be too empty, too present in its own way, filling with the thoughts you were trying not to have. Not active engagement. Active engagement keeps you where you are, rather than taking you somewhere else. What works is exactly what we have been doing. A voice, a subject, a sustained, unhurried engagement with a body of material that is interesting enough to hold the mind lightly without demanding the full focus that keeps you awake. The Simpsons, as a subject for this purpose, is unusually good. It has the quality of depth without urgency. There is always more to say about it. The material is genuinely interesting. The history is detailed and specific, but nothing in it requires your immediate action. Nothing in the story of a cartoon's relationship with international censorship demands that you solve anything tonight. You can simply let it wash over you. You can let the names and the episodes and the countries and the complaints settle into whatever part of the mind receives stories told in the slow hours. You can let the voice keep going while you let yourself go in the other direction, down, into the dark, into the rest you came here to find. The stories will keep from morning. They will be there if you want to think about them in daylight. They will be different in daylight, more solid, more amenable to analysis and cross-referencing, and the specific active engagement of the waking mind. But right now they are doing something else. They are the sound that the room has instead of silence. They are the presence that fills the space between you and the full quiet that sleeping requires. They are the voice that keeps the thoughts company until the thoughts are ready to stop having thoughts. And when the thoughts stop, when the resistance finally eases and the night takes you where you wanted to go when you started this, Springfield will still be here. Still running. Still the same impossible town in the same impossible geography with the same family in the same house on the same street. You can come back to it whenever you wake up. It will be there. It is always there. That is the whole point. Total runtime of this script at average audiobook narration pace, approximately 130 words per minute, is approximately 5.5 hours. Adjust playback speed to your preference. All episode references are to officially broadcast versions unless otherwise noted. For episodes that have been officially withdrawn from streaming platforms or broadcast, this script describes them as historical documents of television history rather than as endorsements of their current availability status. Sleep well. One more thing about the night. The episodes we have been through tonight, all of them, the banned and the restricted and the edited and the pulled and the diplomatically complained about and the affiliate refused and the self-censored, they were all made by people sitting in rooms. Writers' rooms, recording booths, animation studios, production offices in the specific geography of Los Angeles in the specific years between 1989 and now, by specific people with specific educations and specific senses of humor and specific ideas about what was worth saying and how it was worth saying it. The people in those rooms were not thinking about censors when they were thinking well. They were thinking about the thing they were making, about whether the joke was funny enough, whether the emotional beat landed, whether the character was doing something the character would actually do, whether the scene was earning its place in the episode. All the institutional pressure, the network reviews and the standards and practices, memos and the affiliate calls and the international broadcaster concerns, all of that arrived after the thinking. It was the world responding to the thinking. The thinking happened first, in the rooms, in the specific human interaction of people who were trying to make something good and who, in the best years and the best episodes, made something excellent. The resistance the show generated, across its entire history, was resistance to what thinking produces when thinking is done well and honestly. Thinking done well and honestly tends to say things that power finds uncomfortable. It tends to notice the gaps between what is claimed and what is true. It tends to follow implications past the point where they are convenient to follow. It tends to arrive at places where the official narrative has a hole in it, and to describe the hole rather than looking away. The Simpsons was, at its best, the product of a great deal of that kind of thinking, applied to a cartoon family in a fictional town, applied to the specific absurdities of American institutional life, applied to the universal human experience of being in a body that is mortal, in a family that is imperfect, in a world that was not designed for you. All the restrictions tried to hold back the product of that thinking. They could not, because the thinking was already done. The episodes already existed. The words had been said in the specific voices of the specific actors, captured on recording equipment, distributed to affiliates and broadcasters, and eventually to the infinite distribution networks of digital media. Once a thing is made and distributed, it exists in the world in ways that do not require the permission of anyone who would have preferred it not to exist. The thought was already out there. The episodes were already seen. The arguments were already made to millions of people in millions of living rooms, in the specific, intimate context of the family gathered around the television, or the individual alone after everyone else had gone to sleep. The censors came too late. The show was already everywhere, and it is still everywhere. And you are here, in whatever room you are in, at whatever hour this finds you, with the voice still going and the night still holding you and Springfield still running on the screen behind your closed eyes. The town that was never allowed to be what it was. That was always exactly what it was. That kept being exactly what it was for 36 years and counting. That will be there when you wake up. Sleep now. The show will still be on. The last thing, there is a detail about the Simpsons theme song that most people who have watched the show for years have never consciously noticed, because the theme song plays so often and so consistently that it has become part of the background architecture of their television life rather than something they attend to. The theme is written by Danny Elfman, who composed it in a single day in 1989. It is a piece of music that does what great theme music does. It creates an instant and total sense of place. From the first notes, you are in Springfield. You are in the specific emotional register of the show comic, and slightly melancholy, animated, and somehow autumnal, cheerful in a way that carries underneath it an acknowledgement of how much effort cheerfulness requires. The theme varies slightly depending on which version of the couch gag the episode contains. The couch gag determines when the family assembles on the couch, and the timing of their assembly determines when the theme ends. Episodes with long couch gags run the theme longer. Episodes with short couch gags end it earlier. The theme is elastic. It stretches and compresses around the gag. This is a detail about the show's structure that is also a kind of metaphor. The constant element, the theme, the town, the family, the couch is shaped by what comes inside it. The form is stable. The content modulates it. Springfield is always Springfield, but Springfield shifts slightly to accommodate whatever episode has arrived this week. The banned episodes, the restricted episodes, the pulled episodes, they all began with that theme. They all began in the same place, with the family rushing home, with the couch gag doing whatever it did, with the specific version of Springfield that the week's story required assembling itself around the constants that were always there. And then the episode began, and the episode said what it said, and the world responded the way the world responded. And then it was over, and the theme played again the following week, and Springfield was still there.